but it's the
We
world
all
we
have
live
to
in.
exist, right? We all have to make money.
Yeah, even if it's by appropriating Che.
I mean, I'm wondering who first did that. The guy didn't go into it. Kind of had the guy who was the narrator of this documentary. He just basically brought it up, and how ironic, the irony of it all, and then he moved on to historical fact and or legend.
Yeah.
But I learned a lot from it.
Yeah, it's funny. There's that Chris Marker documentary. Well, it's not really a documentary. It's like a collage.
The Vietnam.
Grin Without a Cat. It's really about kind of the left from, well, and images of the left. You know, from starting off with the battleship Potemkin, and going all the way through Paris '68.
What year was this made?
1970, 70 something. I don't know. You know, but
What's the title?
well, A Grin Without a Cat.
Grin Without
In
a Cat,
French,
like the
French, it's totally different. It's La fond de l'air is rouge.
Something
Which has,
red.
the kind of the nip in the air is red.
Without red.
Say it again.
The apple without red.
No, well, it's like the nip in the air. The le fond de l'air.
Le fond de l'air
Yeah. It's rouge.
Is
The nip in the air
the
is,
nip
is
in the,
red.
right, the nip. That's good. The nip in the air is red.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that's but they have a whole piece in it on Che and him being killed in Bolivia, and they interviewed the Green Beret who organized the Bolivians who killed him.
Yes.
And they interviewed the head of the Communist Party of Bolivia at the time, who didn't like Che at all, and who totally refuted him, said that there was no value to Che, and that's why they didn't support him at all.
Well, and there you have it. This was
But I mean, it's from that time,
I mean, it went into detail about his itinerancy, when he started out from, I guess it was, where was he born? I don't know. He was born in Argentina. And he traveled with his father, and I'm like, when are they going to cut to the chase? And then they finally got to the point where Fidel Castro had organized this insurgency, and they showed the camp and how Che had been shot. He was indecisive as to whether he would take the medicine box before he got shot. He was either going to take the ammunition. He could only carry one.
Right.
And then he got shot, but I think he still took the ammo. Cleared out and left the medicine box. I'm like, and he was a doctor, right?
Yeah.
What kind of guy does this? But there's a lot of loose ends. I have to go back and watch it again because it's in Spanish.
Okay.
And it's like 2 in the morning. So
Is there subtitles or?
subtitles in English?
Yeah.
But if you're not constantly watching the screen, which I'm doing anyway all day long, and my eyes are hurting. So anyway, let me chow a little bit here.
Yeah.
But my first job when I came to the city here 1,000 years ago was I landed as a temp at the Church Center for the United Nations. 2 or 3 weeks in, they placed me they made me a resource center assistant or something where you cataloging the library. So I got to read a lot of stuff. It was pretty radical back then. The Methodist Church were helping. That was the days of Vieques, and they were helping with the refugees. And Bill Sloan Coffin would come as a regular. And one day, this lady walked in. The elevator opened, and she announced herself, and she said, I'm, please don't, maybe I'm remembering this wrong, but she said, I'm Che, I said, may I say who you are? And she said, I'm Che Guevara's sister. Did that make sense? Did he have a younger sister?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I can Google it.
And I was just, this little green thing from the sticks. Just like, oh. So she was, Bill Sloan Coffin and a bunch of others were having a meeting in the conference room like 13 feet away from me. So that was my little early experience. Really interesting experience. Who knows what they're doing now? Who knows what they're doing now? I mean, I don't even know. This complex church center for the United Nations is where it was. And I think it's still there. It's 777 UN Plaza, but
Yeah, it's still there.
the UN is never in the news, right? Unless,
Oh, it is. Absolutely.
is it?
Yeah, it depends on what news you watch.
Well,
If you watch CNN, you're not going to see it.
what happened to RTV?
If you watch RT, you'll see it all the time.
Where,
Or Al Jazeera, you'll see it all the time.
when I moved to the Bronx, those channels went away. I think they don't come with Optimum.
No, you basically,
The mafia fascists who are Optimum, I hate
you
those.
got to get streaming
today?
video.
You have to pay for it.
No. I mean, you can buy a Roku box, which is you plug your internet into
His
it,
dog died.
and
Yeah.
and then you get all these TV
Like a
channels
couple of days ago.
on it.
Is it a special device you have to buy?
A Roku box. It's but they're only like $90, you know.
Is there any truth to that box they've been advertising on TV, the magic box, where they say don't pay,
Huh?
don't pay for
I don't have
channels?
the right
Oh yeah. Well,
But I
that,
think the words are the
I'm
same.
like,
that's
should I get that?
that was the old way of getting, you could get bootlegged, cable TV boxes, but
Were you at the
sometimes they
Black
were
Skin? I saw you too. Yeah.
they were actually more
It was a
expensive.
good evening.
Yeah, it was,
I thought
yeah.
it was good. I thought the guy who was the most intellectual, he's very layered, the tall
Yeah,
guy.
yeah.
He was very good. you
Yeah,
know?
he was the best.
I thought so too.
Yeah, he had a
by
lot to
far.
say, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I know Kasembe many years, but you
Yeah.
know, he always, but anyway.
Yeah, but he did that. He had a lot. They actually, all of
Right.
them did. I'm glad they talked about like the fact that it is, we actually are trying to like manage surplus people.
Yes, exactly, yeah. No, he was good. He was very good, and actually, it's good. Are you going to
France
any of the other
Phenomenon.
films or no?
Maybe, I don't know. I have to see what the schedule is because there's also the LGBT Film Festival.
Which one is going?
LGBT.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's a good thing that they're doing that, though. Yeah. So if anybody wants water, there's some
Where
left.
is this? Was that the Thursday night thing here?
It was the Thursday night.
It was Wednesday.
It was Wednesday night at
Bam.
BAM.
Oh yeah, when I was at LIU and there was no class, but then I walked by BAM and the
Did you go to the
Sun Ra Orchestra was playing.
Really?
I didn't end up going.
Oh yeah,
It was
Del
30 bucks or
Arto,
something,
yeah.
I wasn't ready for that.
Wow.
Orchestra?
The
Sun
Sun
Ra.
Sun Ra.
Orchestra.
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 Yeah. I don't know if they're coming to the Vision Festival has already happened. One.
So were you able to see it?
I didn't go.
Oh, you didn't get it? Yeah, they have police outside Jimmy Kimmel all week.
Okay.
I came out to ask the police. I says, "Are you expecting some terrorism from the black skin, white masks?" What? No, Jimmy Kimmel's here. So
You're like, nobody wants to kill.
yeah.
Different kind of
There's
terrorism.
15 cops, five wagons for Jimmy Kimmel.
I played on his show once, but I didn't even meet him.
Oh, you went on a show once?
Yeah, I played on the show once, and he
Oh, yeah.
he
He
put
didn't even
it on
come down.
stage, recorded it,
Yeah.
and then like we never even saw it.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Oh,
Well done, very clean.
It's all edited nicely in.
All very
now.
cleanly done. Oh, boy. They have it down to a...
Okay, we'll wait a couple of minutes just to people finish eating because it's probably better
Sorry
for
about that.
the visuals. No, it's okay. I mean, no big deal. Last week we had, yeah. I mean, maybe it helps. I don't know. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
What, to
It's all right.
eat?
Yeah. No, I know it's
Yeah,
good to
it
eat.
does help.
I know it's good to eat. It does.
sort of gives it a,
Yeah, really, it gives you that Heideggerian strength to
Yeah.
overcome
I
everyday
wonder what his diet was
averageness.
like. Was it probably very simple? And
He
bread
liked
and
wine, I heard.
I'll
I
send
know a
it
couple of
out.
people that-
I'll send
that
a
actually
picture
met
out
him.
of Heidegger hiking with his wife. They're out hiking.
Did he have like the boots and everything?
Well, they have hiking canes. You know,
Yes.
the Germans like that.
They like that. I told you that Methered Boss analyzed them on the ski slopes.
Oh, right.
Yeah, the slopes, they have the ski slopes out, yeah.
I'll send a picture out. You can all see what his wife looked like.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah, I'm
She was the real Nazi. His wife, Elfrieda.
That's just what Martin
Yeah,
said.
yeah, Elfrieda. Yeah.
Yeah, I brought this.
Well, she does look kind
I
of
brought this for
stern.
show
I
and
would
tell.
take her.
Have
I would do whatever she asked me.
No, I've never seen it, but that's interesting.
you seen this? So, I would like your educated and informed opinion of it.
Can I borrow it the next
Um,
week or no?
Yeah, you can borrow it. Can you bring it back?
Can you return it?
This is
Mike-
this
Mike-
is
Are you
Yeah.
implying that Michael is will just steal it? Or?
Mike, I would try to borrow it.
Actually.
no.
I told you what Hermes meant. You know, it's stealth technology.
Make
You
sure
know,
it's in there.
that's
'cause
the
it might-
code word for Hermes.
It might still be in my computer.
I can already tell that this is anti-Heideggerian just by the photograph. I already see, you know.
Yeah, it looked,
The mustache, a little fuller, you know.
It's a very popular mustache.
I know it was.
What
I
I
know.
don't get is this quotation, only a God, make sure it's in there.
He said that.
You said that in a,
There's
an
actually,
in an interview.
let me just say, only a God can save us now was the title given to an interview, his last interview to Bert Der Spiegel. He gave it to him. And they asked him if there's any hope, and he said, no, only a God can save us now. And that was it. And saving in German really means to redeem the phenomena. So he's looking for a God, you know, like an aletheological, you know, God.
And
that will-
apparently the
yeah.
G in God was lowercase, is that correct? Or-
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Good.
In his speech.
I think his most important, one of the great essays he ever did was the Nietzsche meditation when he meditated God is tot, God is dead. He actually,
Is that in the Nietzsche lectures?
yeah, in the Nietzsche lectures. It's an amazing lecture. Very, very important. Later than Being in Time. But I mean, it's really about, you know, you have to remember, you know, he's writing this in a period of European nihilism, you know, on many levels. So, you know, one way, the so-called, you know, Marxists of the period, of course, all the parties' formations, you know, this was all in a response to what was European nihilism. And of course, Nietzsche saw that as a symptom. You know, Heidegger saw it as the destiny of the West. You know, this is where Western, you know, metaphysics would lead us, would lead to nihilism and the uncanny, most uncanny of the guests, as Nietzsche, you know, says in Gay Science, that most uncanny of guests, nihilism knocks at the door. And so anyway, yeah, in a lot of ways, this only a God can save us now was the last moment. You know, he said all we have today in terms of language, you know, in terms of communications is cybernetics. We no longer have philosophy. We have very little thinking, and all we have is the cyber. This was in the 70s. He said this. Yes, right. Simultaneously, Marcuse said education in America was the systematic moronization of the people. That's what education in the United States was the systematic
Was or
moronization.
is.
Well, it's worse today. I mean, we
Yeah.
need new phrases, you know,
Yeah.
moronization's much too nice for where we are. But anyway, yeah. So I mean, I'll be interested. I have a feeling this is going to be antagonistic, but we'll see how fair it is because I can look at the back of the blurbs. Richard Wolin, who wrote a book called Heidegger's Children, is one of the commentators here, and he's made a career out of Heidegger, criticizing Heidegger. He's part of the industry. Derrida sued him actually and won because of the book De l'Esprit. He's a distinguished professor at CUNY. Wolin. Richard Wolin, historian. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Wolin. Yeah. And Derrida, sued him. Yeah.
Yeah, so they
For
start out with a
misrepresentation.
historical thing.
One. It's a big thing. Rockmore's pretty intelligent. though.
He's feel like what he has to say. I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know if I'm not, totally pro. I don't read Heidegger naively either. They say you'll never read naively again. But, we're not interested in naive, readings. We're interested in naivete when we look at phenomena, but not naive readings. So, anyway. So, okay. I mean, you can keep it. I mean, I can, it's an hour and 20 minutes?
No, you just bring it back
80
next,
minutes? Okay,
next
of
week,
course.
that'd be good.
Okay. And I'll let people know, and then they can go help out Mr. Jeffrey Von Davis.
Go help him out.
Well, I mean, by the video if it's any good. Yeah. It must be his brother, the producer, huh? Terrence. It's like Bob and Harvey, huh?
I'm not sure. I
Weinstein,
didn't
huh?
even read They interview a student of his who's
He was a student of Heidegger's?
no,
was
there's
that?
most of the interviews are professors,
Okay.
either from German or American universities.
Okay.
Open it and make sure it's in there because it might
Right.
still be in my computer.
Oh, okay.
Is it there?
Yeah, it's there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then
See,
they.
they have Martin and the wife here.
Yeah,
Very
that's
nice with the
great.
children. Herman. Herbie.
Herman and the Hermits.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right. So, okay, I guess I have this. We got this too, so that's not that. We'll use this. We'll use this up before we go to the one roll. So today I want to do text, right? Do the introduction, hopefully in its entirety, or at least to the outline of the thesis. I'm going to start retrospectively with section 8 on the outline of the thesis, and then go back to section 1. So I have a kind of a plan, a plan of reading and presentation today. I do want to mention, and I will comment a little bit more on this as we go forward, is that, again, crucial, if you will, to Heidegger's introduction. And as I mentioned, the introduction is sections 1 through 8, he said, are still worth reading even after he made the so-called turn. And this is what he thought was important for the future. The other 75 sections, he didn't really give a commentary on. He didn't say throw it out, but again, he said the important part was 1 through 8 for his purposes after the so-called turn of 1947. And, I'll speak more to that. So again, what we talked about somewhat last week is he is really searching for building a fundamental ontology versus the foundational. And we'll go back to this because this is in the chapter being read for today. So this is very important to keep in mind. I don't think I need the historical parts here with Bouffray and the various epochs. But again, you will see the word history and historicity and historicality coming up in his vocabulary, and it's not the way we normally do history. And we're going to talk about that a little more in terms of how he makes the move to this history of being. First, through Dasein as the interrogator of everydayness and the one thrown into everydayness. And you can think of Dasein not only as human subject or their being, but also as a site. This is a kind of interesting way maybe to look at it in terms of orientation as a site. S-I-T-E. Yeah, not as S-I-G-H-T, no. We'll get back into that. So anyway, So let me go to the text, and I won't put anything on the board until we need to, so to speak. So today, again, as I gave you in the outline, we have the three notions, and let me put this up again. I'm sorry. Sometimes I can't help myself. Wiederholung, a very important word, which literally in German means to haul along, literally, right? But repetition, recapitulation, right? And this is a very, very important word that he uses, and retrieve. So 3 senses, if you will, of the word. To retrieve. The retrieve is going to be done by Dasein, both by sight and the subject and subjectivity. Repetition. We will get the repetition of terms throughout and a repeating of the concepts that we're trying to find. Yeah? The repeating of the is in order to find, the predicate of something. As well, and then of course recapitulation. How do we, do the historical? So all of this retrieve is being done by the exemplary moment of the retrieve is done through Dasein. And as I mentioned, the book can be seen at one level as this existential analytic. Right? This is a very fundamental part of the Dasein and the Dasein analytic and what is called the existential analytic, and how we're going to go through this. The other thing is, of course, the idea of fundamental ontology, the prejudices about being. We're going to go through that today, as well as the questions of being. What is the full priority given to the question of being, both in its meaning, what is being, if that's possible, which he doesn't think it is. It's an empty concept. And ultimately, of course, its directionality, its meaning, its sense, and where we're going to go with this. And we're going to talk about questioning as well. All right? So why don't we go to the text, and please, if you have questions, ask, but I wanted to, do this very carefully today from the internal out. So if you turn to, again, the first page is an epigraph from the Sophist of Plato, which is part of the later dialogues, which is fundamentally concerned with the distinction between the sophist and the philosopher. And in general terms, the sophist is one who makes a living on giving lessons in formal argumentation. The sophist is not interested in unveiling the truth. He's only interested in the techniques of formal argumentation and becomes expert in the art of persuasion, one aspect of rhetorical, ability, So they're very, very involved in this.
Very ontic.
Yes, and they're very ontic participants, and the sophist begins with the stranger, the Iliadic stranger who comes in and asks the question. We have become perplexed, we're confused. The question of being has been trivialized. And again, I want you to keep in mind, he is doing this long meditation once again on just this epigraph. This is what Heidegger does best, in my opinion. He can take apart, or one sentence, if you will, a paragraph out of ancient philosophy and build an entire, set of, reflections and arguments on this. Yes?
What do you mean by the Iliadic stranger?
He's a figure.
E-L?
From Ilia, yeah.
Ilia?
Yeah, Ilia. Yeah, that's the home of Parmenides, by the way. Yeah, it was in Italy. I used to go to a few classes back in the day when I was a little more hip. Someone would say, "It's the Iliadic strangers here." So anyway, I like that phrase. It was done in good feeling. I was pegged that way. Anyway, all right. So Again, for manifestly, what appears, what phenomenalizes, you have long been aware of what you mean when you use the expression being. We, however, who used to think we understood it, have now become perplexed. And again, this is going to be the question, that has now been thrown out. Then Heidegger, of course, replies, do we in our time have an answer to the question, what we really mean by the word being? One, not at all. So it is fitting that we should raise anew the question of the meaning of being. But are we nowadays even perplexed at our inability to even understand the expression? So he's already separating out expression from meaning, very early on. Not at all. So, first of all, we must reawaken. So you're going to reactivate, right, through this retrieve, an understanding, for the meaning of this question. How are we going to understand this meaning? So again, to go back to this point about nihilism where I began, the nihilism, of course, has thrown the world into meaninglessness, fragmentation. Right? We have many poets and others who, attest to this, etc. It's also the beginning of no longer, we have cinema has been invented. We have the montage, so there are many new things out there, right, trying to address the problem, but again, are fragmentary, right, in their approach to this question of nihilism. So his aim, his goal is going to be here to work out the question. Not to give us the answer, but to work out the question. I want you to really be aware of this, working out the question. This is what Heidegger does best. Despite all the other, I know there's so much flack out there, so much surrounding this proper name, etc. I think his value, at least to our classes here, somewhat to the left, is this ability to ask questions and how to frame them. This is what Heidegger does best, and very, very important to keep this in mind. So, and to do so concretely, and the concreteness will be done through the existential analytic, through our everydayness, where we both interrogate ourselves and we interrogate, the world. So the simultaneous thing is going on. And the main thing, again, to remember here, really a chief aspect of this, if you will, of the Dasein, is to render Dasein transparent in its being, so that you are able to ask the question, in transparency, no longer through an opacity, a hiddenness, what he calls covert operations later, covert reasons. You see where intelligence agencies get their language from. Kant talked about covert reasons in the 18th century. Now we have, covert action. Right? In a sense, this is something that plays out, 150 years later. So the provisional aim, again, is the interpretation of time, right, as the possible horizon for any understanding whatsoever of being. But the reasons for making this aim, the investigations which such a pursuit require, and the path to his achievement call, first of all, for introductory remarks. So we're going to have 30-something pages of the introductory remarks before we're going to take on the ambitious project. And he does have a sense of humor. I mean, we laugh, but, he obviously knows. And, and I don't know the German well enough, but I've been told by some people who have read this in German that Dasein und Zeit, that it's filled with plays of language. Oh, yeah. There's a lot of playing of the language. I mean, I've seen some of it operative. Have you seen it? Do you know German? Or?
No.
Yeah.
It seems obvious. Even
yes,
through the English,
right.
You can tell
right.
he's doing
yes,
that.
Indeed. And the Wiederholung, the repetition into irony, into recapitulation, this whole thing of
Well, it makes sense that he went into poetry analysis later too. He's just so much so focused on the words and how. I mean, this whole book is sort of, as far as I can tell so far, about finding the right words, defining them,
right.
and how are we using them. And he's
right.
it's sort of an abstraction on poetry itself.
Yes.
In a weird way.
Very, very true. Okay, so yes, David, yes.
Yeah,
please.
Visual aim interpretation time is a possible horizon. Does he mean that posited as the horizon, or is it one of them, among many possible horizons?
No, I think it is the possible. I mean, I would put the definite article around that, because ultimately this is going to be read, as being as time. That being, the answer to the question, what is being, is time. However, in order to get to that, we must see Dasein as the site from which we are under the horizon of temporality. And he's going to go through this. Now, there's one way of reading this text. I'm going to just throw this out, because there's a lot of strategies of reading Heidegger. One strategy would be to go to section 80, I think it's 82 or 81, for example, page 410, and around there in the text. Do you have the same edition there, Sean? No.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is section 82, and the contrast of the existential and ontological connection of temporality, Dasein, and world time with Hegel's conception. Well, I'm talking about the whole section, but then the footnote is crucial. That's basically on page 410, a very long footnote to which he refers to in the introduction. So one could, in some ways, when I mentioned we could do a retrospective reading, in some ways this footnote as well as section 82 actually provides, taking David's question into mind, this forms the hermeneutic, of interpretation from the horizon of time.
This Derrida's note on a note.
Yeah.
Derrida makes a note on this note, right, in Margins of Philosophy, okay? So, as well as have others. But Derrida's is, of course, the most famous. But a lot of people have done commentary on this, but Derrida's is fun. It's a fun piece. A note on a note in Being and Time, yeah? In which he shows how, the being in time is sort of programmed through temporality. He's trying to do this in his way of doing deconstructive maneuvers. Yeah, please.
It seems to me like he's using the word possible only because, well, first of all, it is all sort of very
provisional.
At least in the introduction,
Yes,
it's very
that's
provisional.
right.
He's saying,
Exactly.
we haven't answered anything. I'm not even trying to answer
That's
anything
correct.
yet. We're just trying to draw out this question.
And remember, again, this proposition of Kant, where I began, a couple of weeks ago and repeated last week, possibility is higher than actuality.
Yeah.
So it's always the possible, and this is a text about futural encounter.
I think
it's not about, only the past or the retrieval of the past or the recapitulation. It is really futurally oriented. He's not,
As affirmative as he seems to be, I think he's really sure not to be.
Yes.
And making that
That's true.
possibility higher than actuality.
Absolutely.
Means that saying it's the possible horizon is even a bigger statement than saying it's the actual horizon. Yeah.
And yeah. Okay, good. All right. Well, so that's one way of going back. Let me just mention one other thing before we get into the introduction. As he states in the introduction, and I'm going to go to section 8. Go to section 8 here, which is on page 37, right? The outline of the treatise. He says, the question of the meaning of being is the most universal and the emptiest. But at the same time, the possibility inheres of its most acute individualization in each particular design. If we are to gain the fundamental concept of being and the prescription of the ontologically requisite conceptuality and all its necessary variations, we need a concrete guideline. The special character of this ontological investigation does not belie the universality of the concept of being, for we may advance to being by way of a special interpretation of a particular being, and this is Dasein, in which the horizon for an understanding and a possible interpretation of being is to be one. But this being in itself is historical, quote unquote, right? So that its most proper ontological illumination necessarily becomes a historical interpretation. Okay, the elaboration of the question of being is a two-pronged task. And therefore our treatise has two parts, and our treatise has therefore two parts. Part 1, and this is what he completes, right? The interpretation of Dasein on the basis of temporality, Zeitlichkeit, right? And the explication of time as the transcendental horizon of the question of being. Part 2, basic features of a phenomenological destruction of the history of ontology along the guideline of the problem of temporality. The first part is divided into three divisions: the preparatory, fundamental analysis of Dasein, Dasein and temporality, and then time and being. Now I want to mention here, he does not finish.
He doesn't do the third.
He does not do the third, the time and being, and that's in a lecture from 1962 entitled Time and Being. He engages this question, right? Okay? Then, all three of the second part are not engaged. The second part of the treatise that was projected, Kant's doctrine of the schematism in time as preliminary stage of a problem of temporality. This is worked out in 1929, Kant and the problem of metaphysics. You want me to put it on the board, or can I just, you want me to put up the names of the texts? Okay. Kant and the problems of metaphysics, 1929. This is working out the questions of the schematism, being schematic, which in Greek schema means to figure something. How is something figured out, right? Figured out in a literal sense, schematized, right? And this is in Kant and the problem of metaphysics. And he also, is going to engage metaphysics, again, from the standpoint of fundamental ontology. You guys are with me? I mean, remember we tried to distinguish fundamental ontology from metaphysics, which is looking for firsts, right? Metaphysics is looking for those first principles of which things move, whereas fundamental ontology is really trying to ground all the disciplines, becomes the soil from which all the being of the soil from which all the disciplines come from. And we'll be seeing this in the work. So Kant and the problem of metaphysics is this book. And I recommend, if you're really interested in these kind of things, to read this. It's a reading of the Critique of Pure Reason, in particular, the Transcendental Imagination, as well as, what is a schema. And he begins the notion of problematization, what we consider today the notion of the programmatic, which is a phrase used constantly by the Althusserians. This is 1929. The Althusserians pick it up in 64 and 65. Okay? So, the schematism. Right? And this is 29, so this addresses that part of the second treatise, the second part of the treatise. And then the second one is the ontological foundation of Descartes' cogito sum and the incorporation of medieval ontology into the problem of the thinking thing, right? The cogito sum, etc. To best of my knowledge, the only places he really engages this directly, if you will, is in The Age of the Worldview, which is on Descartes, and again on the question concerning technology. So these are texts of the 1940s and 50s that he engages this. And then thirdly, finally, Aristotle's treatise on time as a way of discerning the phenomenal basis and the limits of ancient ontology. This was taken up in what we were looking at last week in the rest of the book. It's part of the course where he engages Aristotle and Aristotelian conceptions of time in a greater way, right? Especially a reading of the fourth book of the Physics, which is where Aristotle elaborates series of non-points and serial time, if you will, right? Okay? So, just so you know, he only completes very little of the projected provisional treatise.
Well, he does a nice summary of it in the introduction of those arguments.
Yes, we're going to go through it. Yeah, no, I know. That's why I'm beginning here, because it gives you kind of this retrospective backwards. Yes, Josh. Yeah.
When he says that the question of the meaning of being is the most universal and the emptiest,
right?
He's referring to Nietzsche calling being the emptiest.
Nietzsche called being an empty fiction.
Right.
Yes. And he's also talking about emptiness as the Buddhists may talk about emptiness and nothingness as well. So keep this in mind too. It's not only Nietzsche who's, he has this kind of bent, or if you will, this kind of, tendency towards the East, right?
I was wondering if there is a Buddhist interpretation or
Yeah, there are lots of.
reaction to this.
I'll bring you some.
Okay,
Yeah.
good, because it was
Yeah,
doing the same thing.
there's a very good book called Religion and Nothingness by a Japanese. Yeah, you know
Because I
it,
felt
right?
like he
Yeah,
should have been
yeah.
reading the Tao or something like that.
Yeah.
'cause I'm
Yeah,
like-
well, he is reading the Tao too, but he's not really actually participating
Right,
in
he's
that reading.
trying to do
Right.
his own interpretation.
Interestingly enough that you bring this up,
German.
I mean, the interesting part would be, in my view, the treatise could be done on Heraclitus and the Tao, right? You could be doing this on the pre-Socratic fragments, particularly Heraclitus, who is about change and the universe as a childish play, or the dice throw, if you will, the building of paths, another way in terms of the way, and so he's actually, very close in some ways. And if you read on the Way to Language, which is a collection of small little interviews that he has, one with a Japanese interlocutor, he actually speaks about this, that the world, and remember, being is not a concept. And he actually mentions that. Yeah, good. See, Josh is on top of this, right? So, anyway, the being is, there's no conceptual base, and you can correct Nori if I'm wrong about this, but according to Heidegger, no, in this conversation with the Japanese is basically saying that the Japanese is not a conceptual language. It doesn't lend itself to the formation of concepts. So this is another thing, both empty and universal. Universal in the Hegelian sense, if you want to deepen this a little bit, in terms of the logic, Arto and Hegel's logic, where being plays out actively. There's being, becoming, right, and nothing, the triad of the logic, if you will. And then, of course, the emptiest, meaning that both Nietzsche, the Japanese interlocutor, etc., would say being is an empty space, and maybe what we're in search of is that empty. What that empty is we might not get the quiddity of it. It might only be a sight. It might only be, it's along this line. Yeah,
it's paradoxical logic.
It is paradoxical. Yeah. Okay, Arto, I'm sorry. What were you going to say?
Wasn't he in communication, correspondence with the Japanese philosopher in the 30s?
There was another philosopher too. Yes. Yeah. No, I mean, this is, once again, everything aside from our leftist friends, our liberal democratic friends, who see nothing but anti-Semitism,
and he's a fascist.
Or that he's a fascist and all of this. This is still one of the most important thinkers, that existed, in the history of philosophy, and the one that, again, took on the task to rewrite, philosophy when it hit a standstill, to rewrite this ontological moment, through what he would call the forgetting and the trivialization of being. That we just take it so much for granted. We've trivialized it, we've made it so superficial that we no longer have,
It's interesting. I was reading this excerpt on The Power of the Japanese philosopher. At the end of his life, he said he spent his whole life studying the question of nothing and these other programmatics and being.
Right.
He came to the conclusion that he doesn't really understand anything.
Yes.
So, and then he died. So
Right, okay. Well, that's what happened. Death puts the end to the understanding.
But to him, that was sort of
human
the satisfying
finitude.
sort of aspect
Yes.
of reaching that state
Right,
of
right,
clarity.
right.
Which is kind of amazing.
Capitulated with non-understanding.
Right.
Which is a great anti-liberal argument also, or anti-dogmatic Marxist argument, which believes in this scientific understanding of the world in a very concrete way.
You had something else to say, or okay? I was gonna.
I also saw
Please.
some kind of strange threads to pragmatism in this.
Yeah, there's been you put up the Dreyfus piece.
Yeah.
Hubert Dreyfus is a kind of an interesting mix. He's a kind of Heideggerian pragmatic philosopher here in the United States. His book, I think he wrote an introduction to Being in Time, or kind of pony, if you will, to the text. He and Paul Rabinow, again, wrote a book together on beyond structuralism and hermeneutics, in which they engage, their own various Heideggerian backgrounds. So yes, we can maybe go over, and pragmatism, comes from the Greek word pragmata, the things.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I want you to,
there's-
he's well aware of this.
It's not like
He's
in
well
the same
aware of
current,
this,
but there's
right.
some
Well, the
conceptual
ready to
underpinnings.
hand and the things towards hand, the
Yeah.
Zoomhanden and the Vorhanden are both present and ready to hand are concepts that could be used by the pragmatists.
And the destruction of metaphysics.
Yes, well, that's going on with the positivists,
Yeah.
the pragmatists,
The
the
big-
Marxists.
big thing around
the
that
big
time.
thing that was
Yeah.
going around at that time is the confrontation with the metaphysical. So okay, so let's go back. So I wanted just to say that he has this outline, this schema, if you will, of his treatise, and he's going to return now to, let's see where he's going to go here in the introduction. So first of all, chapter 1, the exposition of the question. So exposition, as everyone knows, an exposition is taking something out of its position, explaining it, showing it. And the nice thing about the French, they have great words for this, explication du texte, right? You basically both unfold the text and you explain it, right, as you go along. So anyway, first of all, he begins with a Kantian vocabulary, the necessity of an explicit repetition of the question of being. Okay? So the question has today been forgotten, although our time considers itself, and here's the historical reference, progressive, and again affirming metaphysics. Page 1. All the same, we believe that we are spared the exertion of rekindling a Gimanta Machia, the battle of giants concerning being, right, from Plato, another part of the Sophist. But the question touched upon here is hardly an arbitrary one. It sustained the avid research of Plato and Aristotle, but from then on ceased to be heard as a thematic, and ceased to be heard is, again, crucial here. I'm sorry to emphasize these things, but Heidegger is about the ear, very much about the ear. Ceased to be heard. We no longer hear as a thematic question of actual investigation. What these two thinkers, Plato and Aristotle, achieved has been preserved in various distorted and camouflage forms down to Hegel's logic. So already he's telling you, look, I'm going to undo the distortion. I'm going to take away the camouflage. We're going to go through this as we go forward. This is my role in this treatise to make this happen. He's also speaking about his own history of being, that being, since Plato has taken a wrong turn in terms of Western metaphysics, that it ends up as nihilism. So Western metaphysics, which culminates in Hegel's notion of absolute knowing, led us nowhere. So this is one of the reasons we're going to rekindle ontology and maybe take another path. Okay?
He does give a really privileged stance to Plato and Aristotle, it seems. Like he feels like they had the closest thing. Or they had some things wrong.
Yes,
something
however, he's going to position himself, and keep this in mind as we go through this, as a counter movement to Plato and Aristotle.
Oh, okay.
It's Plato and Aristotle who sort of messed up the tradition, even though we have to retrieve it and rethink it. Yeah. So this is what he's going to go through. So, and what then was wrested? He uses these kind of verbs from phenomena by the highest exertion of thought, right? Albeit in fragments and first beginning, has long since been trivialized, right? We're not only, perplexed, confused, bewildered, but we're also the product. Because of Plato and Aristotle, this has been trivialized, right? This whole notion, right? Okay. Not only that, on the basis of the Greek point of departure for the interpretation of being, a dogma has taken shape, which not only declares that the question of the meaning of being is superfluous, but even sanctions its neglect. You're going to sanction the neglect of being. It is said that being is the most universal and the emptiest concept. Okay? And I, again, repeated that, as part of the, his thinking about being. As such, it resists every attempt at definition. So be aware of the fact that Heidegger, unlike Plato, after the dialogues on the aporia, is not really in search of a definition. right? He's not really out to define things here. He's out, again, to build the path and the method. It's not about defining being. Being is indefinable in some ways, in a lot of ways. Okay, so this is where he's trying to go. Nor does this universe need any definition. Everybody uses it constantly and already understands what is meant by it. Thus, what troubled ancient philosophizing, and remember this is a verb, and kept it so by virtue of its obscurity has become obvious, clear as day, such that whoever persists in asking about it is accused of an error of method. So he's taking on everybody here. The Vienna positivists, right? To a degree, some of them are, not Lukács, who was much more sophisticated, but certainly, parts of, the Marxist philosophy that really wasn't up to this level. Lukács was up.
The worldview of Marxists.
The worldview people that we talked about too, yes, indeed, right, etc. I mean, he considered Marxism a worldview for a long time, until the 1950s, late 50s, where he began to understand a little differently Marx from an anti-humanist perspective. But Marx, for him in the beginning, still remained trapped within the humanist tradition and was also still part of Western metaphysics, that tradition. And we'll talk about that later. I mean, I want us to try to get through this because, I mean, there's so much, 14 weeks doesn't, do justice, much less, 52 weeks of this stuff. I mean, in some ways, of where we could, create fields outside of the text, to really discuss and where they're going. But most of you are aware, and I know I've talked about this often, about the anti-humanist debate, right, that takes place in the Althusserian school with the rest of the Marxist tradition. And then folks like Lukács become part of the last of the Marxist humanist tradition, right? And whereas for the Althusserians, the structural Marxists, right, some of the other Marxists, like the left Heideggerian Marxists, such as Kostas Axelos, are basically thinking through the question of technology, but not from a humanist perspective. Much more from a Stiglerian or on the way to Stigler, who's not a humanist either. Yeah, Stigler comes out. Frankfurt School would not be humanist either, in my view. Especially the Adorno, the later Adorno. And Marcuse probably could still be somewhat in the humanist, maybe, somewhat, but certainly not Adorno. Yeah, he understood. I think he understood capital so viscerally, To me, Adorno, at least from what I've read of him and discussions I've had, is basically so viscerally hates the system and understands capital so well that it's like, second nature in a way, it's, in a way. And it goes into all of his writing. If you read his writing, it's always an attack on bourgeois production. Always. I mean, I don't know how much you've read of Adorno, but it's all. This is an attack on a different kind of bourgeois production, and bourgeois philosophy.
Yeah.
Really. This is really trying to take that on, as well as,
It's so parochial or something. It's like,
Yes.
I mean, Dreyfus kind of explains it a little bit, but it's like, it seems like he's very into this small town, pre-industrialized world view, even though he's getting at something really deep about it. I feel like, I don't know, I keep seeing his labor in the the doing things.
Never gets out of the Black Forest.
Yeah, I think that's kind of great.
Okay, cool. I can hear that. Okay, so let's go on and see what he's going to do. First thing he's going to do, and I gave you this, I think in the outline I gave you 2 weeks ago, at the beginning of this inquiry, the prejudices that constantly instill and repeatedly promote the idea that a question in a being is not needed, cannot be discussed in detail. They are rooted in ancient ontology itself. The ontology can in turn only be interpreted adequately under the guidance of the question of being, which has now been clarified and answered beforehand. One must proceed with regard to the soil, and here's, as you just mentioned, why I remain in the provinces, from the soil from which the fundamental ontological concepts grew, and with reference to the suitable demonstration of the categories and their completeness. We therefore wish to discuss these prejudices only to the extent that the necessity of the repetition of the question of meaning being becomes evident. There are three such prejudices. First of all, the most universal concept, right? This is the first prejudice, right? It is not of a genus or a specific difference, but it's more, right? It's not a Platonic concept of being that he's going to engage here. And then he goes through a little bit of the history. I'll read this, okay? It is an understanding of being is always already contained in everything we apprehend in beings. But the universality of being is not that of a genus. Being does not delimit the highest region of being, so falls in the history of philosophy, not in the juridical sense. All right? Despite his dependence on Plato's ontological position, Aristotle placed the problem of being on a fundamentally new basis with this discovery. To be sure, he too did not clarify the obscurity of these categorical connections. Medieval ontology discussed this problem in many ways, above all in the Thomist, meaning St. Thomas Aquinas school, and the Duns Scotus, the Scotus schools, without gaining fundamental clarity. And when Hegel finally defines being as the indeterminate, immediate, right, that which overcomes us and is indeterminate in the immediate, and this is in the logic, and makes the distinction the foundation of all further categorical explications of his logic. And Artaud, reading the logic from a Heideggerian perspective, would be to take being as the indeterminate immediate and then seeing how that plays out in the formation of all the categories, right? He remains within the perspective of ancient ontology, except that he gives up the problem earlier raised by Aristotle of the unity of being in contrast to the manifold of categories with material content. If one says accordingly that being is the most universal concept, then that cannot mean that it is the clearest and it needs no further discussion. The concept of being is rather, on the opposite, the most obscure of all. Okay? So we're not going to get there, like our Japanese philosopher friend who died and says, I still don't understand, right? That's where he's going. But everybody understands what he's trying to do here. He's trying to go through the history of philosophy, right, from Plato forward, and show how the history of being as a concept has been tremendously distorted in each period, and it ends up with Hegel's logic in terms of the building and explication of the categories, right? He's trying to show that is why the concept being has become more obscure. It's not clear, even though it's been accepted because of the writings and its clarity. Right? So he's taking a lot on here, a lot to chew on, from Aristotle to Hegel.
So he's saying the unity of transcendental universals for Aristotle was only a unity as an analogy to the unity of material universal genre.
Exactly. Right, and that's where you get an analogy.
So he was saying Aristotle, right?
You just you're twiddling your hair, huh? Yeah, okay. Good. That's it. Yeah. Like the Hasidim, that's how they think. You know?
Yeah, it is.
I'm just teasing. You know, I had a friend who was, a Jewish friend, but he wasn't Hasidim, but he used to play on that in the class all the time. Yeah. Anyway, all right. So anyway, the concept of being is indefinable. Number 2, prejudice, right? This conclusion was drawn from the highest universality, and correctly so, if definition is achieved through the proximate genus and the specific difference. Again, returning back to Plato's distinctions made in his epistemology of how we take knowledge up. Indeed, being cannot be understood as a being, right? Being cannot be defined by attributing beings to it. Being cannot be derived from higher concepts by way of definition and cannot be represented by lower. But does it follow from this that being can no longer constitute a problem? Not at all. We can conclude only that being is not something like a being. Back to the analogy and to the similes, right? It's going to take away likeness. He's going to take away mimesis here as well, right? In this prejudice. Thus, the matter of definition of beings, which has as its justification within limits, definitude, define really means to demarcate a finitude, right, etc., of traditional logic, which itself is rooted in an ancient ontology, cannot be applied to being. Okay? So this is not something that traditional logic allows us to do. The indefinability of being does not dispense with the question of its meaning, but forces it upon us. Right? So meaning is not especially in the definition, right? Yeah, go ahead, please.
So,
yeah.
When he talks about the traditional logic, the definition, to mark a finitude, traditional
Well,
logic.
definite, right?
Right.
In a way. You break down the word, you're basically dealing with finitude, right? And you're demarcating something about that.
Demarcating.
That's how you're defining something.
A finitude.
Yes.
Essentially,
Right.
you're focusing on a finitude. Right?
Yes, yeah.
And that's a limitation of traditional logic, he's saying. I thought that
So-
was very powerful.
Yes, it is.
Right? Like critique,
Yes.
because logic is seen as sort of like philosophical logic in that sense, in the traditional sense. Aristotelian logic, right?
Right.
Is seen as like, or modern American analytical, like Saul Kripke or whatever. That's seen as like the truth. That's sort of the.
Well, it's the
axiomatic
instrument of the truth.
Right.
The
And
instrument of
Heidegger's
the
saying-
truth, it uses definition, right? It's
Right.
an instrument.
And Heidegger has a problem with that
Yeah.
because the big problem with this, the way I understand it, is that it's precisely this demarking of finitude
Right.
within being, right? Within Dasein, eventually. So it's why would you want to do that? Is basically he's saying.
Right.
You're sort of limiting your ability to be or to think, to do anything if that's the main way through which you
Once
make sense of the world.
this Greek word,
Devastating.
logos,
How
right?
to use them.
Literally means to give an account of. To give an account of. Or to give the reasons of for something, right? This is what logic or logos, how it came to be done. And when Aristotle wrote his multiple, the physics, the biology, the book on the soul, the ethics, all of these things, he needed a logic. It was called the organon, right? And the books were the prior analytics, the posterior analytics, and categories, right, and propositions. And he actually set up the modern, trajectory, if you will, the scheme on which we have basically gone back to studying logic all the time, including dialectical logic. Very much in, because he's actually maps out contradiction. This is where you get the formal contradiction. So they're again, multiple levels working here, but from your purposes, again, Heidegger is trying to break down this traditional logic by saying it proceeds by definitions.
He's saying that the
Yeah,
traditional logic being rooted in ancient ontology, which he's saying is fundamentally flawed, then he can't be applied to being as the way he wants to approach it. But it's
Right.
so you might say being is indefinable in traditional ontological standards.
At least at this point, you can say
Or using
that.
traditional
Do you
logic.
ever
but-
take Gödel into consideration?
He's taking Gödel into consideration,
That's
but go
what-
ahead. Yeah, the indeterminacy and
Well, yeah.
yeah.
The whole. This seems like mathematical logic to me.
Yes, it is. Yeah,
Yeah.
to some ways, it is mathematical
Right.
logic.
So he's trying to
in terms
approach-
of the
Is it trying to
yeah.
approach using mathematical logic to talk about something that you'd see, for me, it sounded like I was reading math logic and also trying to see someone try to fit the Tao and try and explain the Tao through that sort of language.
Right. For Heidegger, that still would be a regional ontology. It would not be fundamental ontology.
Right.
He wants to go further
Right.
back to the a priori. But I hear where you're coming from, and he was very much aware of the indeterminability, and incommensurability, and the paradox and all this stuff. He was on top of this, not to the level that some philosophers like Badiou are today, who use it multiple. This is a difference between Heidegger and Badiou. By the way, I'm glad you bring this up. We'll talk about this as time goes on here. The mathematical ontology is what Badiou thinks is the origin, not fundamental ontology.
there's a problem, yeah.
So it's a very different approach to ontology in Badiou, being an event logic of worlds, and now his third book is called the immanence of truth, something like that. So he has a different notion in which he's taking every mathematical discovery into account, and he thinks that, and I mean this is interesting because this goes back to Plato and multiple interpretations of the divided line, which is if you cross the divided line, you're going into mathematical objects, and this is where reality is. Not in the world of images, the world of supposition, hypotheses, etc. Reality begins with the turn towards mathematical objects. And then there are multiple levels. How can you get to levels of abstraction, etc.,
But not for Heidegger.
So for Badiou, for Badiou, the mathematical, that line, the divided line in the sixth book of the Republic of Plato, is crucial because this is where he sees, the beginning of, the Western ontology, and that this problem is really more resolved by mathematics and problematized more actively than by the ontology of being, right? I mean, or being as an empty concept here. So it's a mathematical, as you said. I mean, it's more along the lines of Riemann, Gödel,
Right.
But Heidegger still see this as ontic theological, or ontic.
Well, for Heidegger, it would be an ontic region for the mathematical, yes. But go ahead, because he's going to say this here. Yeah.
No, go ahead. Continue. Because I was thinking that if you'd read Gödel, you would have figured this problem wouldn't be able to answer, be able to deal with the problem, or answer the problem this way, using this mathematical method. You would always fall short.
Yes, you would fall short.
Yeah.
You still run into what is called, indeterminacy or incommensurability, and this is something, and the undecidable. And these are things that, people such as Derrida and others, take up because they're aware. I mean, they're not scientists or mathematicians, but they're very aware of the discussion that's going on in terms of science and mathematics at this time. But again, for Heidegger, I just want to make this clear. For Heidegger, science does not think. Mathematics does not think. And he wants to interrogate, this is one level of the questioning, the being of the consciousness of mathematics and of science. So this is a major difference that's going on. How we do that is another story. I mean, but I think he's going to give some kind of pointers because again, it's fundamental. It's not foundational.
Right.
Yeah. See, mathematics is foundational for Descartes. Yeah. Our era is still very Cartesian. People forget this. I don't understand why more, quote, Marxists don't study Descartes because it's so dominant in the world today, his thinking, in terms of, the mathematical. He basically said our first principles, the ontology is mathesis universalis, universal mathematics, universal learning, and the mathematization of nature that takes place in the 17th century is playing out actively all the time here, Despite, dialectics, the mathematics of nature, or the dialectics of the mathematics of nature would be a more interesting discussion. Yes. So this is something that, say, a Badiou in the Franco field versus the German will continue to think somewhat like a Cartesian, right? Who was a mathematician too. Descartes invented algebraic geometry. As well as being, one of the great, founders of, contemporary rationalism, or going 17th century rationalism. So again, you have these splits. Now he's going to want to, he's aware of what Descartes does. He's going to encounter him, and this is where the whole subject-object dichotomy takes place. And we'll probably, I'm listening.
Mathematics doesn't establish existence. It establishes relations.
Yeah, but he's still going to talk about relations in existence too,
Well,
right?
he talks about the enigma. The enigma lies a priori.
Yes.
A priori in every relation and being toward beings as beings. That's in the middle of the page.
Yes, I see it. I have it underlined. Yeah.
Yeah, so
I do. I'm with you. Yeah.
So
okay.
mathematics establishes relations, and he wants to go a priori to these relations.
That's right. Before the relations. Yes.
And
Let's look where he goes in number 3, okay? I mean, there's other prejudice. So we have the 2 prejudices, right? You know, the indefinability, right? And the question of the defining of being and the universality of being. And now the self-evident concept, being is used in all knowing and predicating, in every relation to beings and every relation to oneself, and the expression is understandable without further ado. Everybody understands the sky is blue. I am happy, and similar
Those are
statements.
copulas.
What's that?
Those are copulas, the verb
Yes, of
making
course.
relations.
Yeah. But this average comprehensibility only demonstrates the incomprehensibility. It shows that an enigma, which you read, Chris, lies a priori in every relation and being towards being as beings. Okay? So this force structure is already being talked about now. The pre-understanding, the pre-scientific, and the pre-ontological. All within the a priori. Okay, good. The fact that we live already in an understanding of being and the meaning of being is at the same time shrouded in darkness proves the fundamental necessity of the retrieve. To retrieve the meaning of being. Because we're completely in the dark. Even though we think, right? We have an understanding. If what is self-evident in this alone, and this is nice, the Kantian phrase that I referred to, the covert judgments of common reason, is to become and remain the explicit theme of our analysis, as the business of philosophers, then the appeal to self-evidence in the realm of basic philosophical concepts, and indeed with regard to the concept being, is a dubious procedure. However, considerations of the prejudices has made it clear at the same time that not only is the answer to the question of being lacking, but even the question itself, and this is very important. I mean, again, once again, and I know there's a lot of ambiguity here, but I think it's very important to keep this in mind, is obscure and without direction. Thus, to retrieve the question of being means, first of all, to work out adequately, and what are we going to do? The formulation of the question, the next section. So this is its first little introduction. How do we take away the prejudices about how we have, forgotten this question and what we've trivialized? Yeah.
I was going to say, it's just the form of his argument is very mathematical, even though he's trying to
Yeah,
stay
okay.
away from it. It's just
I'm looking forward to the equation you're going to draw. Yeah. I mean, that'd be a good one. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's-
We'll publish that in situations. Yeah.
Do you mean in like how do you mean
Yeah.
that in what ways in mathematics? His presentation.
Well, he's trying to define the concept by showing what it's not. So he's removing a bunch of things from it. Like this
X.
is what we knew. This is what we knew. This is what we thought it was. X
Right.
was this, but no,
Right.
X is not that. X is
Right.
much larger than that. So you can think of X as this group, but being is much larger than a group. But it may not even be a group itself,
Right.
right? So
You're
So
really
we
talking
use-
about sets here.
That's
well,
so
so
interesting.
like
yeah.
this is how my mind works.
Yeah,
sometimes.
I understand. No
So,
problem.
yeah,
trying to
so-
find like the superset that
So
other
I'm
sets
looking
of
at,
members of.
for me, it's like, this is how we conceptually think of these things, but we're going to go talk about something that's not in the set of things that you conceptualize. So we're going beyond that.
Or before that.
We're beyond it before, however we want to put it. So
But
for
the
me, it's
beyond
like,
includes the before as a regional
but
ontology.
first, for me, it's like, he says we have objects, particular objects we understand, but there is something much larger than the object that contains possibly all these other objects that we know about. That may not be an object itself. So first, it presupposes objects. So I go, an object. I understand how it behaves, right? And now we're going to go larger to talk about.
Well, that's where definition would be.
Right.
Presupposes object.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, no,
Something thrown
definition would
outside.
be
Yeah,
what
but
object
here-
is.
Yeah, okay.
Right,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
object could be that thing, but I don't know what it is. But since I defined it, that's
Definable.
where
Right.
it becomes definable, right?
Right.
Right.
So that's interesting. So maybe just to sort of play with your idea. So then his critique of logic then, which would be, logic also does this thing, like it says, okay, well these are our objects that are true because of reasons X, Y, Z, so we're going to use them, but we won't use other objects, but then it stops. Whereas with Heidegger, it keeps going, right? So he's saying, okay, we've achieved a certain object, like what is being, right? And we have three definitions. But Actually, we can prove
we
it to
have
be
three
inadequate. so we keep
notions of
going.
being. We have three notions of being, but those notions are limited, right? Because what we're going to be talking about is something that isn't limited. It doesn't have a container.
It's like symbolic logic.
Where it's
Indefinable.
Indefinable, right?
Indefinable in
but indefinable
ancient
is
time.
something that's understood. So within,
Yes.
in mathematics, so it's just.
Well, it's part of
So-
a pre-understanding
Right.
for ontology that something is
But for
indefinable.
just to formulate,
Yeah.
to say it this way, is he's talking
Yeah,
about,
I
he's using
understand.
actual, yeah.
I think that's interesting. I think that can be used to formulate maybe a sort of a, if we want to use the word, a different kind of a logic. If we
Because
want to
it
use
could
that
also
language.
be,
Symbolic logic, which it works by implication. Some A implies B.
But he's saying
Therefore,
that
C.
he's transcending this thing.
Yeah, yeah,
Transcending
he's-
Aristotelian symbolic logic. He's saying that stakes out finitude, areas of certain discernibility that beyond which you can't go. Like if X leads to B and B leads to Z, then X leads to Z.
Yeah.
And Heidegger's saying that's true, but that still doesn't explain why that happens.
but see, like, similar to that, when I was just listening to when you started talking with the concept of infinity, we don't know what it is, right? But we know how it behaves sometimes. So it could be like similar to what we're doing here. We're looking at something that's conceptually indefinable, but we can see some observations of how it behaves in certain moments.
We can posit existence in symbolic logic, which we can't do in regular logic.
Yes, but what I'm talking about is like, how do we talk about something that's beyond language,
That exists.
that exists in language?
That you kind of know about.
And his method is
Well,
the
phenomenology.
mathematical.
Yeah, I mean,
Right, that's-
his method is to return to the things themselves with,
Yeah,
the,
yeah.
with the emphasis not on things, but themselves. Right,
Right.
that's where the emphasis is on this battle cry of Husserl.
And that's
It's
what-
back to the things themselves to uncover the phenomena and to grasp the phenomena.
That's what
And
feels
then
like the Tao to me.
Yeah, yeah.
Because the Tao,
Because-
Taoists would say,
Yeah.
this is,
Yeah.
but you can define it, you know.
See, he's trying to synthesize here, if you will, methodologically, transcendental phenomenology, which is really about how do we constitute objects and how do we go through this constitutive process, right? What is the object? One question, right? Of course, how do we uncover that object? But also, how are we constituting that object? You know, this process of constituting and constituted. Constantly, you know, in this thing, and how the mind does so, you know, post-Cartesian, you know, thinking thing, extended thing, you know, beyond that of the early subject dominating the object. So it becomes this transcendental phenomenology that's going to grasp, you know, how this process is working. This is one aspect of his method. The other part of the method is to get to the meaning of being, you know, or at least begin to problematize that. And through that, he's going to use what he calls hermeneutical phenomenology. This is where the whole thing of language comes into play, where the circularity of reason, you know, is critiqued, but at the same time, he's building a kind of circle of interpretation, right? So it's really interpreting the interpretation that becomes part of the process, you know, for him too.
Which is
So he
the
has
paradox.
both, yes.
Which is the paradox.
Yeah, always a paradox, or an aporia still for him that he doesn't think he solved. I mean, I don't think we have either today. I mean, we're sitting around talking about like historical materialists all the time, but historical materialism is met a roadblock. It's an aporia. It no longer may be a method that actually is going to get us out of this mess or make us understand this world of algorithmic, you know, automated work that we live in. We don't have the tools yet. We don't have the conceptual, you know, tools to really understand this. We can see it, but we have no real comprehension. You know, yeah,
You know,
go ahead.
maybe- so
I mean,
maybe
yeah.
sort of just to
And this is
connect
the
this-
kind of combination again of we've forgotten so much this question, ontological question, what is constituting this, as well as where, you know, to bring in the mathematical, how are these systems working, you know, in a sense, right? These new algorithmic things, and everything's the algorithm today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like
yeah.
we can differentiate. Like I was
Yeah.
thinking, so we
The
don't
new
have
mathematics.
as Marxists we don't have a way of talking about the new algorithmic work, but the new algorithmic work is happening. So the liberals that are in control of the algorithms are doing it, right? So in other words, there is what's happening here is that there is a logic, if you will, that's functional in the doing, which is not yet crystallized theoretically, right? Which will happen later. And this is sort of what Marx did too, right? People have argued that, like, Marx, when he described the critique of political economy, he was synthesizing a philosophical theoretical exposition of that logic that's functioning in everyday life that already was functioning without the people doing it or using it, thinking about it as a line of thinking. And this is what Heidegger sort of...
Well, the line, again, I mean, the next step in this, in section 2 is to learn how to question. How do you really question? That's the thing. What do we ask of the thing? Are we asking for quiddity? Where is the site of the question? What is being asked about? He has all these very interesting moments here that I think are very valuable to where we're going. We cannot already formulate everything in terms of, I think, modes of production or even modes of exchange for that matter.
I
You have to think it, yeah.
I wonder if he's actually questioning the logic in itself too.
He is.
Because
Yes.
it's also going through here, here.
Yeah.
Actually, like what we assume is logic may need to actually be looked at.
Yes, absolutely. People interested in this, I mean, another book, he wrote 2 books on this matter, or 2 lectures he gave. The Metaphysical Foundations of Logic. So he's looking at what's the backdrop, what he summarizes here in this little paragraph that we read here. He takes up in a book called The Metaphysical Problems of Logic. And then he also writes a very beautiful and accessible text called On the Essence of Reasons. Yeah, which is very, very, very good, which is a reading of Leibniz. Leibniz is principle of sufficient reason. Yeah, in a way. So again, look, you have to think of this, I mean, on multiple levels, I hope, right? You have to think about this as not only is he laying bare the tradition and the phenomena, right? And he's going to try to rewrite, part of the aim here is to rewrite the history of ontology. That somehow with Plato and Aristotle, even though they had the question out there, and they made great contributions to it, it's still the way it was taken up after them is wrong-headed, put us on a wrong path. So he's going to serve both as a corrective, but also a rewriting as a counter thrust, if you will, to Plato and Aristotle in terms of understanding of ancient ontology. So he's going to put himself in a dual role, corrector, right, as well as one who's going to go back to this tradition and reread these texts. This is how he operates. He's going to give lectures on Aristotle's theory of time. He's going to give multiple lectures on Plato's concept of the truth. He's going to give multiple lectures on, the allegory of the cave. He's going to go through each crucial history of philosophy in order to show how this misdirection, this misguidedness, this perplexity took place. And he does through both principles, on the one hand, through arche, the Greek word for principles, commandments, and obedience to some kind of principle, as well as he's going to go through a dismantling of that to show what the structure's about, right, etc. So you're always in this moment. Look, one way of reading this, for those of you that have some background in deconstruction, he's always in a moment of deconstruction and construction, right? He's always working on this kind of dual register, if you will, or this twofold task always. I'm destructuring, I'm delayering, and at the same time I'm, rewriting. Right?
Positive
so this is the thing.
also.
Reconstruction, if you will, or construction. Yes, yeah.
Positive
Positive destruction is really the crucial term.
That's why
probably even better than deconstruction. Yeah.
That's why he likes the first part more than the rest of the book, right? Because the first part really does
Yes.
the job of
Yeah, it's
this
a good
is
point.
actually the problem.
Yeah. Very good
This
point.
is the problem.
Yes.
And the rest of it is impossible.
Well, it's us.
Right. It's impossible
We're
to,
flawed.
within this
Right.
this
right.
framework to be able to
Right.
tackle that problem.
Yeah,
But
Sean Aparicio has is just a Dasein at a particular historical moment, but ultimately, I'm not so sure that's the way the problem, the interrogation,
Right.
would be effective at this point.
exactly.
This is the way he's thinking post World War II.
That's the term.
However, what happens in the United States, existentialism becomes a craze. Everybody has a choice. Everybody's free. The rhetoric. I mean, I'm just saying. I'm not against. But in some ways, and existence really means to be outstanding.
But that's
as
the
well.
answer to the
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
It never answers the question.
No, he doesn't. No.
I mean, that
Yeah.
existentialism is not an answer to the
No, it
question.
doesn't answer. It's not the
well,
answer.
Let's,
No, no, it's not.
at least
It's
we got
not.
this.
And existence really literally means to stand outside of oneself.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean that you're just existing or you're a biological entity or you made a few choices today. You know, you went to this place instead of that place, or you broke up with that girlfriend or that boyfriend or whatever. You made life choices. This is not really what he has in mind. He's talking about the outstandingness at a site. And we forget this as well. We don't consider ourselves, quote, sight or there-ness. You know, we don't really consider us as there-ness in time. We still consider ourselves self-consciousness. You know, we still consider ourselves subjects, human beings, right? All this humanistic talk. Right?
I saw a lot of self-consciousness in his.
Okay,
idea
well,
of
fair
Dasein,
enough.
but
Yeah,
we'll get
yeah,
there in a few
yeah.
pages. So
Okay, good. Okay, we'll wait for that. All right, let's go through his levels of questioning. The next part, because I really want to stick to. I'm trying to stick as much internally to the text now. This is good because I see 4 or 5 people are really definitely been engaged here. All right, so the question of the being must be formulated if it is a or even the fundamental question. Such questioning means the suitable transparency. Thus, we must briefly discuss what belongs to a question in general in order to make clear that the question of being is an eminent one. What is the privilege of being questioned? Beyond the trivialization, the superficial, etc. Every questioning is a seeking. Every seeking takes its lead beforehand from what is sought. Yeah? Questioning is a knowing search for being in their thatness and in their whatness. Okay? This is important again too. The thisness, the thatness, and the whatness. All in one. Right? This dog here, that cat there, and that line over there. What? All right. The knowing search can become an investigation as the revealing determination of what the question aims at. As questioning has what it asks about. Okay, what questioning asks? All asking about is in some way an inquiring of, besides what is asked, what is interrogated, also belongs to questioning. So both asking of something and interrogated. And this is not a verb that he just uses by accident. He's really talking about full interrogation. Here, right? The interrogation. You wanted to say something else?
No.
Yeah.
No, it was just the same. Yeah.
Okay. So, what is questioned is to be defined and conceptualized in the investigation. So as you proceed along, after you know what you're saying, that's when you define, right, and conceptualize. That is the specifically theoretical question. As what is really attended, what is to be ascertained. So we have 3 levels here, right? What is being asked about, what, and then who is interrogating, and 3, what is to be ascertained. As an attitude adopted by a being, the questioner, questioning has its own character of being. Questioning can come about just by asking around. Yeah? How'd you like that course? How'd you like that, restaurant? Exactly. Right? Or an explicitly formulated question. What is peculiar to the latter is the fact that questioning first becomes lucid in advance with regard to the above-named constitutive characteristics of the question. Right? Explicitly formulated. The question to be formulated is about the meaning of being. So, he begins, again, very careful in how he proceeds. He's going to ask, what is questioning? What are we after here, right? Who does the questioning? Who's the interrogator, or the levels of interrogation, and what is to be ascertained in this? And now he's going to talk about how are we going to formulate this problem, the question of the meaning of being. So, okay, the question to be formulated is about the meaning of being. Thus, we are confronted with the necessity of explicating the question of being with regard to the structural moments cited. The 3 structural moments. What's it about? People used to say about films, this was a thing in the 70s and the 80s, I don't know, people, well, what was the film about? And we would go, that's the stupidest question you could ask. because, it was really just at a very elementary level,
Well, that-
the first question. But for Heidegger, yes, he wants the aboutness, right? What it asks about, right? But it's about is the narration. He's asking about what asks about instead of what is it about. Okay? There's a difference between aboutness, right?
Plot summary.
And then yeah, exactly. As a seeking, questioning needs prior guidance from what it seeks. The meaning of being must therefore be available to us in a certain way, and we intimated that we are always already, and you can see Derrida's language here, Chris, I just want to point out, always already involved in an understanding of being. From this grows the explicit question of the meaning of being and the tendency towards its concept. We do not know what being means, but already when we ask what is being, to determine conceptually what the is. We stand in an understanding of the is without being able to determine conceptually what the is. Right? So again, this is the pre-understanding, the scientific. We do not even know the horizon upon which we're supposed to grasp and pin down the meaning. This average and vague understanding of being is a fact. This is most people in the world. They have no idea, no clue. I mean, you could write clueless in the margin here. This is part of the everydayness.
It's also essential to Dasein, right? This
yes,
is
it's essential to Dasein. One of the characteristics is Dasein is clueless. Right. On all of this, right?
He didn't use that word,
yeah.
but I like that.
No, it's good. It really is clueless. Yeah. Okay. No matter how much this understanding of being wavers and fades and borders on mere verbal knowledge, the indefiniteness of the understanding of being that is always already available is itself a positive phenomena which needs elucidation. However, an investigation of the meaning of being will not wish to provide this at the outset. The interpretation of the average understanding of being attains the necessary guideline only with the developed concept of being. For the clarity of that concept and the appropriate manner of its explicit understanding, we shall be able to discern what the obscure or not yet elucidated understanding of being means, namely, what kinds of obfuscation or hindrance of an explicit elucidation of the meaning of being are possible and necessary. Furthermore, the average vague understanding can be permeated by traditional theories and opinions by being in such a way that these theories, as the sources of the prevailing understanding, remain hidden. What is sought in the question of being is not completely unfamiliar, although it is at first totally ungraspable. What is asked about in the question to be elaborated is being is that which determines being as beings, that in terms of which beings have always been understood, no matter how they are discussed. The being of being is itself not a being. The first philosophical step in understanding the problem of being consists in avoiding the muthon pra diathea is not really telling the story. And this is where I talked last week about the storytellers and the narratologists being kicked out. That is, not determining beings of beings by tracing them back to their origins to another being, as if being had the character of a possible being. As what is asked about being thus requires its own kind of demonstration, essentially different from the discovery of beings. Hence, what is to be ascertained, the meaning of being, will require its own conceptualization, which again is essentially distinct from the concepts in which beings receive their determination of being. Okay? So, finally, insofar as being constitute what is asked about, and insofar as being means the being of beings, being themselves turn out to be what is interrogated on the question of being. Beings are, so to speak, interrogated with regard to their own being. But if they are to exhibit the characteristic of their being without falsification, they must, for their part, become accessible in advance as they are in themselves. The question of being demands that the right access to beings be gained and secured in advance with regard to what it interrogates. So again, this is the drive for transparency in being, the transparency of Dasein. But we call many things existent, and in different senses, everything we talk about mean and are related to the existent in one way or another. What and how we selves are is also existence. Being is found in thatness, whatness, reality, the objective presence of things, subsistence, validity, existence, and in the there is, to which being, in which being is the meaning of being to be found, from which being is the disclosure of being to get its start. Question mark, right? Is the starting point arbitrary, or does a certain being have priority in the elaboration of the question of being? And this is where he's going to use Dasein, right, as the interrogator. Dasein, our sight, our there being, becomes the sight of the interrogator. Okay? So it's only through Dasein we have access to these questions. Right? And it's the close. Yeah.
His footnote at the bottom.
Yep.
The section footnote.
About object and Gegen.
No. Misleading exemplary. He talks about the essence of as Dasein plays to and with being, brings it into the play of resonance. I thought that seemed important to me.
Where is that? On what page?
Sorry, it's the footnote.
The co-player?
No, it's the last note on that page.
Misleading.
Misleading, yeah.
That's over the section itself?
Yep. No, it's just a footnote. They just use that symbol. It's from the last sentence of the paragraph you just read.
Oh, yeah. Dasein is exemplary because it is the co-player, okay, the Beispiel, that in its essence, as Dasein, perduring the truth of being, plays to and with being, brings into the play of resonance. Yeah.
That was a nice, and that was like his
right.
later footnote
Yes.
on it. I thought it was a nice description of Dasein.
Yeah.
Resonance is a word that he uses later?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Right. Okay. Being, in which we ourselves, to each case, top of page 7, are, and which includes inquiry among the possibilities of beings, we formulate terminologically as Dasein. So this is the first time we see Dasein as the, quote, exemplary moment of the retrieve. I keep emphasizing that, but it's only through ourselves, right? Our Dasein, our being there-ness, and sometimes he'll hyphenate in that word, and sometimes he'll keep it together. So sometimes it's Dasein, being, their being, sometimes it's da, there, and then the being, right? So the question is when is he really using the emphasis? This is the fodder of a lot of academic waste of paper, right? which is really going on. Yeah. Anyway.
Also,
okay. Please.
Also, another good footnote by Heidegger: the Dasein as held out into the nothingness of being held as relation.
Yes, it's held as a relation. That's correct. Yeah. That's on the bottom of page 7, first footnote.
Also, at bottom footnote on page 6.
Yep.
In the same sentence, he uses Dasein hyphenated and Dasein not hyphenated.
Yes, he does. Yeah. It's confusing, right? I mean, again, maybe we could go through one as, we as interrogators, the other one as the site of the interrogation. I mean, maybe that's one way to go.
Discusses that a bit.
Does he? Yeah, Schmidt. I'm not crazy
the
about
forwards
it.
or the preface, one of the two. Does
Probably
it.
probably
They
both,
talk
right?
about how it must have been the forward because this edition they decided to go with the unhyphenated in general. Because in the later usages, he sort of switched. He uses both, and so they did went against his specific request in the first translation.
Right. So anyway, the next I won't read the whole thing, but again, this is really the whole the section, this section 2 of how Dasein is held out, right, as through which the interrogation will take place, right. I'll read from page 8 the kind of summary. Where we have discussed up to now, neither has the priority of Dasein been demonstrated, nor has anything been decided about its possible or even necessary function as the primary being to be interrogated. But certainly, something like a priority of Dasein has announced itself. So instead of the nihilism knocking at the door, now it's Dasein announcing itself to the world is this new interrogator. And they play on each other in a way. I mean, there are obviously incredible amount of, signifiers that are, going through the history of philosophy here. So, it announces itself, is another thing. Okay. The next one is the ontological priority, and this is an important passage for what we've been talking about in terms of fundamental ontology. And I don't know if you guys, want to, say what you got out of it, but For me, this is where fundamental ontology replaces foundational, work. This is a shaking and a breaking of the foundations in the discipline, and you're going through a new fundamental, ontology. So anyway, let me read a few of the crucial passages. If you look down at being is already, the third paragraph, the totality of beings can, with respect to its various domains, become the field where particular domains of knowledge are exposed and delimited. These domains, for example, and this is interesting, history, nature, space, life, human being, language, and so on, can in turn become thematized as objects of scientific investigation. Scientific research demarcates and first establishes these domains of knowledge in a rough and ready fashion. The elaboration of the domain and its fundamental structures is in a way already accomplished by the pre-scientific experience and interpretation of the region of being to which the domain of knowledge is itself confined.
I thought that was like an incredibly interesting point. About
Well, it's very
pre-predicate,
insightful.
Like
Yes.
pre-logical thought
Yes.
already happens before
Pre-scientific
the logic
and
is already
pre-logical.
formed.
Yes, that's right.
So
And-
this is why scientific thinking is not really thinking in that sense, because it's second order.
Well, it doesn't
the
think.
thinking already happened,
It doesn't think.
right?
It's experiential.
Yeah, he says pre-scientific
Well, no.
experience.
Yeah,
Not
pre-scientific,
pre-scientific knowledge
not knowledge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and
So-
interpretation.
Yeah, so anyway, let me go on here. So the resulting fundamental concepts comprise the guidelines for the first concrete disclosure of the domain. Right? Whether or not the importance of the research always lies in such establishment of concept, its true progress comes not so much about in the collection of works, collecting results, right, and storing them in handbooks, right, such as the periodic table. You can go through the whole, the whole 9 yards, as in being forced to ask questions about the basic constitution of each domain. How are these disciplines? How are these domains established, and what constitutes them? He's really asking very radical questions.
Founding
How do we go in?
presuppositions.
Yes, right? These questions being chiefly a reaction to increasing knowledge in each area. Over specialization in Lukács's sense, right? Over determination of certain fields, right? Exactly. Okay. So let me go on, because I think this is a very interesting section on how the disciplines are founded, right, and what domains. And that Foucault, as I mentioned before, order and words and things, or the order of things in English, basically has taken on in terms of determining a new research paradigm, and that's a loaded word, but anyway, a new heuristic, right, in which we're reduced to three basic areas: life, of which he's going to get biopolitics out of, life, biology, the biological, labor, political economy, and language, linguistics. So these three, and what were you saying? Yeah.
No, it's just written those categories here.
Yes,
So,
right. This is what Foucault was in order of thing, in which he reduces our era to the era of political economy, biology, and linguistics. These are the three domains. No more philosophy, no more history, these kind of things, but, the life of which, and the political economy is biopolitics. The birth of biopolitics that some of you in this room, read parts of last time in the Techniques of Servitude, right? When we read parts of and the other one on the speculative Saussure thought since '68. So anyway, let's go back. What was that? What happened?
Good title.
It was. It's good. We're at the pause, man. Forget the aporia and all these impasses. We're at the pause, the great pause here. Yeah, the poem has been interrupted. Yeah. Anyway, the real movement of science takes place in the revision of these basic concepts that Nori was referring to with Foucault, which is more or less radical and lucid in regard to itself. A science's level of development is determined by the extent to which it is capable of a crisis in its basic concepts. Listen, we talked a little bit about, doing a social ontology of cancer. How would you go about this? First of all, you're going to have to overturn, the crisis and all the concepts that are being used. Right? How do you go about this? If you're going to really do, radical research, if you're going to really employ, quote unquote, the radical imagination, which literally means to reroute. We have forgotten the question of the, the rerouting of the imagination in our age, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
And how do you go about this in terms of, new types of problematizations and making sure we're at least on some kind of path. We might not get, the absolute results, but at least we change the framework. This is what we're doing.
Yeah.
We're not so, and I'll use another verb, we're not so ensnared by where we're thrown today. We're ensnared. I mean, like it or not. We're always ensnared. We're, in
The
this,
bigger
this
the building
throne.
gets, the more questionable the foundation becomes.
Yes, yes, yes. So, yeah, go ahead. Yeah. In these imminent crises of the sciences, the relation of positive questioning to the matter in question becomes unstable, right? You can't ask that here. That's not traditional. That's not the norm. We don't do things this way here. It's basically
not realistic.
Oh, wait. You're always going to hear that. Yeah. Today's tendencies to place research on new foundations have cropped up on all sides in the various disciplines. But the discipline which is seemingly the strictest and most securely structured, mathematics, here we are, right, has experienced a crisis in its foundations. The controversy between formalism and intuitionism centers on obtaining and securing primary access to what should be the object of the science. I mean, you want to comment on that a little bit, since you?
No, because
yeah,
the
please.
formalist and
Yeah.
solutionist, I'm thinking about the sort of the Parmenides questions about infinity.
Yes.
Like that Newton had to deal with.
Yes.
And then the foundations, I'm wondering if he's talking about Gödel.
Yes, he's probably talking about Gödel.
Right, which is,
As well as who was the mathematician, Einstein's, who mathematized the Russian, the 19th century mathematician, right? Yeah.
I'm thinking the
But anyway.
intuition wasn't in the 1920s. There was a Dutch mathematician by the name of Brouwer who criticized set theory.
Yeah, there were many intuitionists that criticized Ford, and that's the distinction between intuition and
You
formal.
can't use
Right.
mathematical axioms unless
Right.
they're totally proven to be unquestionably true, and
Right.
it's not possible.
Right.
In order to do that.
If you guys are really interested in, and you may be, the French have a magnificent tradition in this. Jean Cavalier, who was a formal and dialectician, dialectical logic, is really one of the best on this. He died early. He died in the fighting in the Spanish Civil War. Communist, very, very interesting person. One book, The Logic of Science, on this thing, a magnificent, magnificent thing. And he wrote a long essay, sort of in treatise form, called The Logic of the Concept.
Are they available in English? Or?
Yeah, I think it's available in English. I'll check. I may have a copy of it. I have a first edition of his book on the theory.
I have a history of logic. Do you know anybody worth reading?
The best on the history of logic that I know is a person named Pascal Engel, Engel, and has done good work. And another man on axiomatic is Robert Blanc. Blanchet. I'm sorry. He's maybe the best on the history of logic.
Okay.
And this is one, right? I'm not sure how much of his is translated, but Engel has been somewhat translated, and the other person I mentioned was John Cavalier. Yeah. For people interested, this is extremely sophisticated stuff,
John Cavalier
Cavalier who died in the Civil War.
Right.
He's known as the unknown soldier number 5.
Okay.
That was his number. Buried, yeah. He's absolutely behind Foucault, Georges Cantillon, everybody took their court of departure for Cavalier. A legend in Paris. Not read at all in the States. Very few people. There are few of the structural Marxists have taken him up, in terms of his early work. Yeah.
Because of this, we know that he can't do this. Ultimately, solve this problem, answer this question.
Yes, I know that, but I want to go through the, sometimes it's good to go through the journey, right? I mean, I'm just, yeah. I think it's best not to really look at this as a problem, but to look at this, and I hate to use this Christian language. No, it's okay. I'm just trying to make a distinction here. Maybe to look at it as a mystery. It's an enigma. It's an enigma, right?
Problem in terms of mathematical language.
Yeah, I understand. I understand. And let me just say this too. Husserl was much more attuned to the mathematical. Husserl's first book as a phenomenologist was on the origin of arithmetic. And his second book was the origin of geometry. And he was very close to Gottlieb Frege, who was probably the best of the mathematical logicians, right, of the 19th century into the 20th century. And Frege, again, is not read actively in the United States. Very, very small corner of people are studying Frege. But very, very interesting stuff, that he does. And on symbolic logic as well. And these are other fields. I mean, I know some of you are in Stanley's, in the first course of the day, dialectical logic. But there is a dialectic in mathematics, too. I mean, there's a lot of dialectics happening, a lot of movement. And you have to see this as well as operative, right? In this the formal, the symbolic, what is ordinary language versus extraordinary language. So these become all part of a mass of problems. Since you mentioned these highfalutin people like Gödel and Ryman today, etc. Going back to what you were talking about last week, just for a second, Arto, was the difference in repetition. You begin to see here that Deleuze wants to take up a lot of the mathematical logic as well, vis-a-vis the ontology of difference, and he's going to use this Wiederholung, this repetition, in a different sense. So, he's going to do so for mathematics. And he's also going to take on the Platonic, difference between genus and differentia as well. And this is going on in his work on ontology, difference in repetition, which is 1968, by the way. It's finished. Yeah, right in time for May.
I just learned this, that Deleuze's first course of lectures that he taught is in Heidegger, and it's called On the Foundations.
Yes.
And it's all about Heidegger.
No, it's absolutely. This is extremely radical thinking. Again, like the politics or not. I mean, I'll keep repeating that, but anyway, that this is a really
you may have been a Nazi,
right.
But even like this idea of the indefinable, it kind of goes against this, positioning him exclusively as a Nazi. I mean, for me, it's like he's decolonizing thought, for example.
He is.
I mean, so it seems impossible, and I think he's like, you can't define it, but then you still have to engage this indefinable thing. I think that's super radical.
Yes, absolutely, and also the radicality of overturning the disciplines. I mean, in a certain way, to say that these are regional ontologies that we're going to work with. I mean, this is really it. That please.
I didn't want to say during Stanley's class, out of respect, but as a communist myself, maybe part of the Nazi dynamic was this revolutionary dynamic that maybe was even more revolutionary than the communists at the time, about overturning certain things in ways that I don't like and I don't agree with. But
this is called the conservative revolution. It's not called the revolution, but it is a revolution. And if you read people like Junger is talking about other levels of alienation when he talks about work and total mobilization, and in a way the elements of what we see in terms of people traveling all the time, how outsourcing works, all these things are very much contained within Junger's little piece called Total Mobilization, written in the late 20s, early 30s, of which Heidegger loved. He loved this piece because it was, mediocrity, everydayness, the dictatorship of the they self, all of these things fit into him, even though, And really, again, look, communists and the conservative revolution had one enemy in common, basically a basic enemy in common, anti-capitalist. They were both anti-capitalist, and that's right. The conservative revolution despised liberal democracy and the bureaucracies created. They despise this, you know. I mean, the communists, on the other hand, had notions of democracy that never really played out, but I mean, at least they kept that term. You didn't get that with Heidegger, and only a God can save us now. He says, they asked him if democracy, he's not convinced it's the way of the future.
Right, I think I read that.
Yes. Only a God can save us now.
You know, but I was.
Yeah. So anyway,
Heidegger
I'm glad we have a little levity in between this Teutonic overload. Anyway.
But you know, Heidegger says somewhere, I think in the Lectures of Metaphysics, about he hates the average, the mediocrity of the average.
Right.
And I remember randomly just reading on through these Lenin like obscure speeches to like factory workers and stuff, and Lenin says the same thing. Says our primary enemy is the mediocrity in thought and in being and in existence.
Right, sure.
Like we don't want to exist in the mediocrity of the liberal world of going to work and like coming back, or the bourgeois mediocrity.
Well, yeah.
Like
I mean,
going
look.
to the theater.
Yeah.
You know, in kind of like a neutral kind of.
I mean, both the ideal, you know, we talked about this last time with Nietzsche when we did Nietzsche. The Übermensch is operating on multiple levels here. One, it's the new man in the Gramscian - Che Guevarian sense, you know, to go forward with that. And in their case, the new man is, you know, a different type of being, you know, in a sense. Now, Junger writes on pain. You know, you have to overcome. You know, it's not only, you know, look, the old cry was you either change yourself or change the world, right, or change the, you know, the society, right. In Junger's case, you have to change yourself first before you're going to change anything out there. And you know, there used to be a sense, you know, revolution begins at home. You know, and I always like Heraclitus. You know, when the story when they went to visit him at his house and he was in the kitchen, and they said, "What's the great master doing here?" In the kitchen, and he says the gods live here too. Right? So this is you know, something that's kind of, you know, important going forward. Listen, I'm certainly not trying to make an argument for either conservative revolution as being the way, but this is an extremely powerful moment, you know, that is played out even today in much lesser forms, but is behind a lot of this thinking. You know, I know David brought up last week Steve Bannon. And you know, he'll throw around terms, and you know, you began to see this return of this Heidegger during the talk, and Reagan the would write, you know, this was always, you know, it was somewhere. Being was in every other sentence. It was part of the cultural, and that's been the first major. I think the counter revolution. Yeah. But anyway, you know, in the 80s, you know, like, communicate. In Berlin by Goethe, earlier this week. It's just probably, you know, and we had a session on because he has all brain brainwashing. I went back and read the piece of girls' advice exactly in schools today. Don't read images. Important, and these are not stupid. Saying as Goethe parables, right? Right, exactly. Or Burnett, different story. I mean, the women thing that was genius. You guys know the story, right? Suffrage movement to go out, mink, you know, down Fifth Avenue.
Smoking
horses, the liberty.
Was also
Well, yes,
he went through the
a lot of them.
socialist-
Well, Mussolini too. Yeah. What were you gonna say, David? I know you had.
I don't know if people saw the latest op-ed piece from Charles Crow of the New York Times. who is not my favorite.
Right, right.
You know, I keep waiting for his head to explode.
Right, right.
This is really a good dissection of Hitler's language and how it pertains to Trump. And, you know, he took from a lot
Yeah.
of other social scientists and all, but really dissected it in really substantive ways, not just, you know.
Right.
He actually used Judeo-Christian, Trump did in the tweet. He said, our job is to recapture Judeo-Christian, the primacy of Judeo-Christian values. Like, he actually used that
We forgot those, huh?
language.
Yeah, right. Another. All right, let's look at the crisis and the foundation just a little more. I think this is next one.
Are you on 9 still?
I'm on 9. The concept of activity to expose nature's own is in itself. You want to nature? Theory and physics grew out of the tendency to expose as it is in its the theory to nature immutability also by denying all relativities. Confronted by the question of the structure of the pre-given area of knowledge, that is, by the problem of matter. In biology, the tendency is awakened to get behind the definitions that mechanism and vitalism have given to organism and life, and to define this as Goldstein, by the way. Very good book for the organism. You know, you probably know Goldstein, psychologist and biologist. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Basically, define the whole concept of abstract thinking versus concrete thinking.
Yes.
Based on his work with brain damage.
Right.
Right.
Right. Yeah. He's an interesting figure. Very interesting figure. I think the book is called The Organism, right? One of his books? Yeah, I think it's called The Organism. Yeah. Anyway, okay. So, in biology, the tendon mechanism given to organism and life, and to define anew the meaning of such in the and humanistic discipline, the drive towards historical actuality itself has been by the transition. The history of literature is to become the history of critical problems. Theology is searching for a more original interpretation of human beings towards God, prescribed by the meaning of faith itself and remaining within it. Theology is slowly beginning to understand again Luther's insight that its system of dogma rests on a foundation that does not stem from a questioning in which faith is primary and whose conceptual apparatus is not only insufficient for the range of problems in theology, but rather covers them up in distortion. So Luther's the great revealer of the Catholic distortion. Yeah, well, go ahead, I'm listening.
He definitely hated them too.
Yes.
So then this phrase of his only a God can save us is said facetiously, right? Given that theology...
Yes and no.
I'm
sorry. The little g. Yeah. The little g.
But let me just clarify.
Okay, no problem.
These disciplines are also going by the term regional ontologies.
Yeah, they're all regional because he's, again, fundamental ontology is going to look at this, how these are securely structured. They've been part of the, quote, foundations. He's going to shake the foundations and hopefully replace this by a fundamental ontology. This is where the question begins. He's not interested in closing down the biology department or the literature department. That's not what this is about. It's about regrounding, if you will, setting on a course a new path of possibilities, both for research and asking this question of being again.
I think he's just regrounding them. He's not taking them down. The biology will still carry on as it's been.
But it's not foundational anymore.
Right.
It's not foundational. It's not considered as part of a foundational. See, the separation that I was trying to do last week is between the fundamental ontology and the foundational. And what he's doing here is shaking the foundations. He's breaking the foundations. And I don't know, some of you probably remember anti-foundationalist thinking. Do you remember this? This was going on 80s, 90s with Rorty and other people. This was out there. as a topic, right? You know, we cannot get a foundation. We're too fragmented. We're too off, you know, center. We're too marginalized. Da-de-da, for example. This goes back to what, you know, in mathematics they use terms such as incommensurability of the disciplines, indeterminacy, all these kind of things, taken from both physics and mathematics, because indeterminacy is taken from Heisenberg.
Right.
Yeah, so, yeah. So they're
this-
working, yeah, please.
This doesn't
And-
begin to
Yeah.
address,
In terms of being.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
this doesn't begin to address, or neither is it a precursor to today's trend of interdisciplinarity that's supposedly happening.
This is a joke. Go ahead.
I'm making a joke.
I'm sorry to say that.
That's what
I'm going to go viral with this on YouTube.
Interdisciplinarity.
What did he say?
Joke.
We don't need him at this place anymore, all these core curriculum? No, I'm just, yeah.
No,
Go
you're
ahead.
saying interdisciplinarity.
No, I
the
mean, you
idea
know,
would
in a
be
way.
a joke to him.
The idea
Doesn't
here
mean
is
keep it
more
up.
transdisciplinary, if you want to think of it that way. It's not so much the interdisciplinary, it's really the transdisciplinary. That it's going across all the disciplines.
Disciplinary.
You know, and in some ways, yes, he's looking for the pre-constituted disciplinary at the same time. Okay?
Yeah.
So in some ways. So yeah. And this gives you a tremendous
philosophy-
liberation, if you will, right? It's not, go ahead, I'm sorry.
So philosophy isn't foundational, but
No.
it's
Fundamental.
Fundamental. And if you want to say it's philosophy, he's saying it's ontology. He's not saying it's philosophy. I mean, he's trained as, quote, a philosopher. He's reading philosophical texts. But again, he's going to go the way of, he's going to write another very crucial essay in his corpus called The End of Philosophy and the Task of Thinking.
He says what is philosophically primary on the next page. That's his
Yes,
interpretation
yes,
of historical
right,
beings with
right.
regard to their historicity.
Right,
I was
please.
going to ask you a question
Yeah.
because you sent me off in the direction when you said Heisenberg. Do you ever think about the uncertainty principle in terms of the three questions that he posed before about Dasein?
He mentions Heisenberg, by the way, in an essay on Paul Klee.
Because if you look at the double split,
Yeah.
you know the double split problem? Whether you
A
have
little bit, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It depends on, this has part, you can take the three parts before, what is being asked, what
Right.
you're looking at,
Right?
who is asking. If I look
What is
over
it
here,
about? Who's
if I look it over
asking?
here,
Yep.
it looks, I have a different result than if I look it over here. So temporality, time, in a sense.
Yes.
Right?
It's also very dialectical, right?
Right.
Heisenberg's entire formulation.
And what's being interrogated? Well, we don't know. Depends on where we look and where
Well, the
we
being that
time.
interrogates is the,
Right.
what can be ascertained is the knowledge.
Right. Right.
Right.
And it's very, it's real world.
Right, no, I
application
understand,
of that sort
yeah,
of-
no, I understand that.
Yeah.
Yeah, this became, somewhat interpreted too, after all this kind of, the questions you raised, which are all very good. This led to a language which is called that of subject position. What is the position of the subject?
Okay.
What is its Setzung, which is also military language in German? What is the position of the subject? In terms of orientation. Again, so that's a good question. And so, from where was the subject standing, right? Or from where was really the position, from where not only the political position, but the position of orientation.
But it's also
Not
the-
whether you're a social democrat, a revisionist, a reformist, whatever, Really the question was, where's the position of the question, so to speak. Yeah. Of which there's always a
And that's all
politics.
historically
Right. We know
determined.
this.
Yeah,
Right,
and it's
right,
also
right.
it's in time as well.
Right.
Right. It changes.
Right.
Past and present seem to kind of merge together in this. I mean, I know it's all.
He has a lot of this. I mean, again, he'll use this category. I mean, this is another play on the German, and we'll certainly go over this later. But you have the German word Dasein, which is essence. We translate it as essence, but this is active. The Dasein. It's a very active. It's almost a verb of an activity of becoming. Right, even though it's been translated as essential, and then sometimes when we get this essentialism in the United States and essentializing as bad terms in identity politics or in other things,
Becoming essence.
Yes, becoming essence is better.
Yeah.
That's right. You're becoming essence.
Ah.
I got
Right.
you. It's
Yeah.
okay. You can use that bathroom. Becoming essence. Yeah. So anyway, this word, and then presence is anwesen, right? So you have presence, right, in terms of the actual becoming in the now, if you will, or in the present.
But Wesen is a noun or a verb?
Well, it's a noun, but it actually is a verb too, you know. Yeah. See, this comes from the Latin esse, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, to be. Yeah. So essence not necessarily is essentializing or you fixed an essence. So when Sartre, for example, was that the police? When Sartre speaks about the fundamental tenet of existentialism, when he writes that 1946 piece to the Polish Communist Party, he says existence precedes essence. That is the precept of existentialism. And what he means by that is that the outstandingness is greater and comes before, if you will, the fixity of an essence in the tradition, but also before the becoming now. So the existence, how you stand outside of oneself, is always proper. So this takes away from categorical thinking. I want you to realize that how radical this really is, because in a way, it's no longer a question of one's identity or whatever. It's really the question of how one is outstanding, how one exists, that becomes the prevalent thing. Right? Yeah. This is much more radical than saying I'm this, I'm that, or whatever. Thatness and whatness. I'm not saying that, I'm not going against a lot of the progressive stuff in terms of, that we've gone through the issue. I think you read that book, Sam. I mean, every page is underlined. Right? Jesus. On a marginal note.
You had 2 weeks to read it.
I hear you. I gave you 2 weeks. Good. Like they used to say about New York, the city's so nice they had to name it twice. Right?
New York.
It's not really that way, but yeah. So what else? Yeah, please. Yeah,
I mean,
I'm sorry.
when I was reading this section, also I was thinking if we if we start thinking this way beyond these categorical thinking and identities, social class, whatever, people have always, and this is something I didn't have an answer to, if they ask you, well, if you imagine a post-capitalist, the limits of capitalist society and what comes next and how do we even begin to think about it when we have no classes, what the hell is Marx talking about? Well, Heideggerian language or Heideggerian thinking in terms of post-categorical perception of the Dasein is one way to imagine sort of an articulation of a post-categorical.
Well, it's not a post-categorical, it's understanding how the categories were formed, etc. But yes, we're going to go beyond. Yeah, right, exactly.
Fairness and whatness.
We're not going to be fixed in categories. Yeah.
I'm a proletariat, or I'm a bourgeois, and thus I don't read Marx, right? So this is what a lot of my Marxist friends would say. That's a bourgeois interpretation, and they don't read capitalism. I'm like, how do you know? They read, Marx was bourgeois, So anyways, so I think this is very important.
But you think they're questioning the foundation of those concepts of conceptualization. Re-questioning.
Yeah. Let me just do something real quickly apropos of this on the board, just to give you an idea of how this works in Heidegger. One other little thing apropos of this. So it's connected. I'm not going on a tangent here. So just do one other thing. So remember, this is going to be an engagement, and we'll go back to this too. Remember, I said the 1929, Kant, the problem of metaphysics. So Kant is engaged with in the Critique of Pure Reason with physics, of course, Newtonian physics, right? And you have a Copernican revolution in turn. He's doing what one could call a metaphysics of nature as well. Just want to show you maybe one way of going around. And he writes the Critique of Pure Reason, right? And Heidegger is engaging this. Remember, we spoke, Heidegger is going to work through the tradition, right, in order to retrieve it and to overcome it. So this is Kant, and as you know, probably most of you, 1720 to 1804, Kant, in his productive years, or 1760s till his death, right? I mean, he doesn't publish his first book until he's 50 something, which happens to be the Critique of Pure Reason. but probably to get a job like all these Germans and publish the book, right? Right. So 1929, this is Kant, right back in the day. In the 1929 Heidegger book on Kant, Heidegger's Kant, right? The physics, right, becomes more generally the sciences he's going to engage, right? And then no longer metaphysics of nature, but metaphysics itself, right? And then the laying of the foundation. So he's reinterpreting Kant within the tradition, laying the foundations for metaphysics. So how do you ground, again, philosophy for the Copernican turn thinking in the Newtonian version of space? Right? So he's doing this. So this is Heidegger's Kant, 1929. I mentioned the book Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics. Right? And then we get to Dasein und Zeit. This becomes ontic knowledge. The sciences, and earlier, as you see, physics. So read it this way, ontic knowledge, this is in Being and Time, 1927, right? 29, he rewrites, the Kant, right? The Kant and the problem. And this here, metaphysics, this becomes ontological knowledge, no longer metaphysics. The pre-understanding and then the understanding on the way to knowledge. And then the laying of the foundation for metaphysics becomes, if you will, fundamental ontology. Fundamental ontology. So you go from, 17, I think the publication, if I remember, I think it's 1760, 71 or thereabouts. Anyway, you go over a span of about 150 years. Kant is dealing with physics, right? Mm-hmm. And the new Newtonian space-time flexes, right? And the new mathematics that go along with that.
Right.
And probability theory of the 17th century, as well as, discoveries in, late 18th, early 19th century. Metaphysics of nature, he's still engaged in this, of which Hegel writes a philosophy of nature. Obviously, dialectics of nature is coming out of this Kant's attempt to look at metaphysics of nature. This becomes a very German thing. They're very interested in this, etc. We have metaphysics of nature in the United States through Thoreau, Emerson to a degree, Whitman in another way, in differing ways, the American transcendentalist. And then the Critique of Pure Reason is his work. It's reason that will give an account of all this. And I'm going to go back and I'm going to show, how this is all part of reason. And I hope most of you remember this, but, phenomena, that which is above the line and can be seen, etc. And then Kant has this X realm, pneuma, right? And this he could never get to all the way. And this became part of the battle cry for this pneuma realm for philosophy to get to. How can we not get there, right? And this is where Hegel and others use as a point of departure in terms of their epistemologies. How can we get to the pneuma? And somehow this becomes brought together in the subject-object. This kind of becomes brought together. That which is pneumal realm, that which we do not see, that which we do not have engaged, versus the phenomenal that actually is, we've seen. It's phenomenalized, right? So anyway, then Heidegger interprets the Critique of Pure Reason, from the problem of metaphysics, right? He wants to problematize metaphysics in the name of ontology. So he gives a 1929 lecture on Kant and the problem of metaphysics. And this is where he gets the notion, again, he uses the notion programmatic. So instead of physics, it's all the sciences. right, that he begins to look at, in terms of Kant. Instead of the metaphysics of nature, metaphysics in general, right? And then the layings of the foundations for metaphysics. How does this work into our time today? Right? And Being in Time, written 2 years earlier, he's going to, in the fundamental ontology, say this is all part of ontic knowledge. These are regional, to go back, regional disciplines, right? Ontological knowledge is what we get from metaphysics of nature, metaphysics. It actually ultimately becomes ontological knowledge, no longer a metaphysics. It's knowledge about being, right? And then fundamental ontology being his new critique of pure reason. So in one way, he's rewriting the critique of pure reason. I mean, giving you one interpretation of what his task is. He's rewriting the critique of pure reason from 1787, and then through fundamental ontology, with an anchoring in this. Remember the planned outline of the book where we began today at the outline of the treatise. This is the fulfilled project of the schematism, right? How do I do the schematism? How do I undo this? And working back into fundamental ontology. So this is what he's doing. He's laying this bare. Now, the important part about this historically for a lot of people, such as the historian Peter Gordon, who's very good on this, Jeffrey Waite at Cornell, is the Davos controversy with Ernst Cassirer. What is knowledge? What is a priori knowledge, etc. For Heidegger, why he won the day, is somehow he said, no, this is what counts. Kant and you are recoiling before fundamental ontology and this very obscure question. So Heidegger really overturns a kind of neo-Kantian and very open-ended Kantian thinking, because there is no dummy, obviously, right? Taking away symbolic forms. I don't know, has anybody read Cassirer, Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, or any of the Problem of Knowledge? He's worth reading. He's one of the best of the. You know the name though? No? Okay. Ernst Cassirer.
German?
Yeah, what else? I'm sorry. in this class, nothing but, unfortunately.
Looks French though. Cassier.
Cassier? Yeah,
It
Cassirer.
looks French.
Cassirer.
With the C.
Cassier.
Cassier.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cassier. So anyway,
Alsatian.
Alsatian.
Have I misspelled his name?
Cassirer.
IRER, right? Yeah, Cassirer, I'm
That's
sorry.
even more.
My apologies. Well,
We'll forgive you.
so you read it? You read it? A little bit? You read some of his work?
A little bit.
Yeah,
I
by the
didn't wanna
way, if
say
you're
so.
interested in this, please. In this case, this is a very influential philosopher on a very active group of philosophers in the United States who came from Europe and were here, mostly Germans. Right?
Influenced Suzanne Langer.
Suzanne Langer, Philosophy in a New Key. A book also worth reading if you like art and you like music. Yeah, Philosophy in a New Key. So Suzanne Langer was to Cassirer what Hannah Arendt was to Heidegger in some ways. So it's kind of an interesting pairing, if you will. Yeah, I'm glad. So you read that, so that's good. Yeah. I think his best book, he wrote a very good book called The Problem of Knowledge. He wrote a book called The Philosophy of the Enlightenment. But anyway, he has this debate at Davos, and I think I've mentioned this with Heidegger, and Heidegger, of course, chewed him up. He says, you're recoiling before, the transcendental imagination. And he's saying, you're still lost in this kind of stuff back here, and you have not taken the new moment right further, beyond the categories of the transcendental deduction, that's being used, and the transcendental imagination. So Heidegger has this long debate. I'll talk more about this the deeper we get into this. But this is to give you an idea of, how this may work in terms of fundamental ontology, right? That he is obviously trained, disciplined, if you will, in the critique of pure reason. They read this very seriously, they study it, as well as the ancient philosophers. So he's very well of this, but he wants to overturn this attempt, Kant wrote a book called The Conflict of the Faculties, which all faculties should read. Right? So yeah, he's actually, embroiled in a very long history here with the German Enlightenment, German Romanticism, right? All the way up through Weimar. It's very important to keep in mind. This is a battle in the university. What's the ground? What is going to be the ground of the new disciplinary, practices, right? Exactly. Okay? And no longer does he think that these foundations are possible. And he pulls the rug from under, Cassira is a liberal, in some ways, but he pulls the ground from Cassira and says there is no ground. There's the abyssal plane. And that's where we're working from. We're not working from a Grund, we're working from an Abgrund. And unless you know this and see this in terms of our period, you're not really, thinking this through. Anyway, I'll go more over this as we get into this and try to, make it relevant to the text itself. So that was kind of nice. Okay, so I'll just do a few more minutes and then we'll go. I know it's getting on 6 o'clock. So anyway, so Luther's insight. So fundamental concepts, page 9. And again, I find this section to be, it's very, very important. Are determinations in which the area of knowledge underlying all the thematic objects of a science attains an understanding that precedes and guides all positive investigation. Accordingly, these concepts first receive their genuine evidence and grounding only in a correspondingly preliminary research into the area of knowledge itself. But since each of these areas arise from the domains of beings themselves, this preliminary research, and this is important, that creates the fundamental concepts amounts nothing else than interpreting these beings in terms of the basic constitution of their being. This kind of being must precede the positive science, and it can do so. The work of Plato and Aristotle is proof of this, laying the foundations of the sciences in this way is different in principle from logic limping along behind, investigating here and there the status of a science in terms of its method. Such laying of foundations is productive logic in the sense that it leaps ahead, so to speak, into a particular realm of being, discloses it for the first time in its constitutive being, and makes the acquired structures available to the positive science as lucid directives for inquiry. Thus, for example, what is philosophical primary is not the theory of concept formation, right, in historiology, nor the theory of historical knowledge, nor even the theory of history as the object of historiology. What is primary is rather the interpretation of genuinely historical beings with regard to the historicality. And he'll use this in the, we'll get back to historicality as well. Similarly, the positive result of Kant's critique of pure reason consists in its approach to working out what belongs to any nature whatsoever, and not in the theory of knowledge. His transcendental logic is an a priori logic of the realm of being called nature. Again, here the metaphysics of nature and his logic, right? Okay. But such inquiry, ontology taking in its broadest sense, without reference to specific ontological directions and tendencies, itself still needs a guideline. It is true that ontological inquiry is more original than the ontic inquiry of the positive sciences, but it remains naive and opaque if its investigations into the being of beings leave the meaning of being in general undiscussed. And precisely the ontological task of a genealogy of the different possible ways of being, a genealogy which is not to be construed deductively, this is interesting too, requires a preliminary understanding of what we really mean by the expression being. So the question of being aims not only at an a priori condition of the possibility of the sciences, which investigates being as this or that kind of being, and which thus always already move within an understanding of being, but also at the condition of the possibility of the ontologies, which precede the ontic sciences and found them. All ontology, no matter how rich and tightly knit a system of categories it has at its disposal, remains fundamentally blind and perverts its innermost intent if it has not previously clarified the meaning of being sufficiently and grasps this clarification as its fundamental task. Ontological research itself, correctly understood, gives the question of being its ontological priority over and above merely resuming an honored tradition and making progress on a problem until now opaque. But this scholarly, scientific priority is not the only one. So the next section will be the ontic priority, right, and the pre-ontological and pre-scientific. Let me just give you a quick outline of this, and we'll pick up with this, I guess, next time, since I don't want to keep people. I know Heidegger's, it's not like reading Stiegler or some of these other people, even though they're pretty difficult too. So maybe we shouldn't exhaust. Yes, yeah.
Being on time.
What's that?
We're searching for being on time.
Being on time? I'm always just being in time. But anyway, I'm never on time. I'm being in time. Okay, yes, please.
They asked Miles Davis at one point, how you manage to be always ahead of the times. And he said, I don't know, but he said, I'm just in time and everybody else is
out of time. Or behind. Yeah. I don't look back because someone may be catching up on me. Satchel Paige. To use a baseball metaphor. Anyway, he's going to go on to the who-ness, right? The exemplary being of the retrieve. And then the next section will be exposing the horizon for the interpretation. So I'll go through hermeneutics next week, definitely. And then we'll also go through the existential, right? As an analysis of Dasein, the Dasein analytic and the existential analytic. And then I think, the repetition on page 17 is very important to look at that section. He's going to talk about time must be brought to light and grasped with the eye as an understanding, right? Requires repetition in the second paragraph at the end of the sentence for a higher, genuinely ontological basis. And we'll try to engage this Vita Holung a little more, right? And then time, page 17, is also engaged from Aristotle de Bergson. This is where you can compare section 82. If you read analogically, like I do sometimes, you can compare this to section 82 on temporality at the end, and also the note on the footnote on page 415, right? So you compare, section 82 and the others here. This is the last paragraph on page 17, which is worth reading carefully, as is the note on the note is the horizon of temporality. Number 6, the destruction of the history of ontology. This is what he does in the fundamental problems of phenomenology, the coursework he's giving in 27. So again, remember, he's giving a course on the ground problems of phenomenology simultaneously when he writes this book, right? I mean, or almost concurrently, parallel. 29, he's writing on the problem of metaphysics, and then after the so-called kera, the turn, he writes time and being, which try to flesh out some of the things left here. But again, I mentioned, and one of the reasons I want to go through this carefully for problematization purposes as well as for understanding, is that he says these first 8 sections are still important, right, from his point of view. So anyway, we'll try to get through all the way up to what you've read twice already. Maybe you can do it 3 times now, and you're going to be a real expert. Yeah. So anyway, and if you want to go ahead, I mean, I think the propedeutic part 1 is worth reading. I would think we probably could do chapter 1 of that too, the existential analytic. And you have the diagram. I think everybody in the room has the diagram about the existential analytic and the the triadic care world itself.
Chapter
That
one.
I've
Is
done.
that
You
the
didn't
thing
get
you
it?
did
Or-
the first?
Yeah.
You mean section 9?
Chapter 1 is
Yeah, chapter,
9, 10,
yeah, I'm talking chapter 1 of part 1, I'm sorry, division 1, page 41.